Okay, it's just gone 4 o'clock, so I will get started. Thanks very much for joining us. If you're new to this space, I hold these spaces each Thursday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and Sunday afternoons, 4 p.m. Eastern. And the purpose of the space is to look at developments in the news. We obviously rely on lots of mainstream media sources, but then we try to accent those heavily with open source investigation, open source analysis, mainly coming from here on Twitter. At the same time, I'm hoping to work on building up a community, perhaps informally. And to do that, we try to present tools and techniques so that everybody can bring their skills up. If you're not already engaged in open source investigation, you might get to a comfort level where you'd like to start working on that. If you're already pretty experienced, then we still hope we can bring some tools forward that will interest you. And then at the same time, we like to have guests in from time to time in order to present the projects that they're working on, with the goal of taking people who are doing this work already and connecting them so that we can build new collaboration in the future. My spaces rely pretty heavily on use of the nest, which is the space at the top of the window where you can put up links to tweets. As I go through the various issues, I'm almost always putting reference material up there. If you were to scroll to the tweet that's the furthest to the right, that is, I call it my agenda. It starts with the invitation to the space, but if you look below it, it has a list of speaking points and sources. In that way, you don't have to rely on what I'm saying by itself. You can confirm it through those sources. And if you want reading material to follow up on anything that interests you, you'll find it there. If you want to have a look at the agenda to get a little bit ahead, you might identify issues that you have questions about or have comments on. If that's the case, that would be great. We'd love to have you contribute to the conversation. And you can always do that by clicking on the microphone button in the bottom left-hand corner of the window. So I will also mention that just before this, I spent a little over an hour listening to my friends who host the Space Tochny, which is very focused on the developments in the war in Ukraine. And we sometimes cover pretty similar material, but our space is a little bit more focused on the OSINT aspects of it, and that we do go abroad from Ukraine wherever we can find good open source work happening. I believe their spaces is now ended, but I think if you click the spaces link, you should be able to get the recording of the conversation they just had. It was a really good one today. So there's a third item from the right in the nest. It is our community calendar. If you click that link, it will open up in a browser window. And the purpose of the calendar is that because we have lots of friends of the space who enjoy hosting here on Twitter, the search function in Twitter Spaces is very bad. And to keep track of them all, to make sure we don't overlap, in order to be able to kind of promote one another's work, we put this calendar together. Most of the spaces are either related to Ukraine or OSINT. Since we had the calendar, we decided to put third-party events on there, usually talks by universities and think tanks. If you ever have an event that you think would be interesting to the crowd we have here with us, you can always send it to me by email, or by DM, or to Jacoby, who is here listening with us as well. So last session on Thursday night, we had a long conversation about resources, just because there happened to have been lots of them posted in the last few days before that. There aren't quite as many today, so it won't take as long, but if you have a look at the tweet in the nest entitled Events and Resources, there are 3 today. Occasionally I'll put up notice of either job postings in the OSINT space, or in this case, it's about a volunteer project that's ongoing. And so many of you would be familiar with Spook. He was a regular in the spaces for a long time. It seems like he's gotten a little bit busier, and I don't see him chatting in spaces as much. But at the same time, he's been building his own project out, and I think they produce a lot of their work mainly on Telegram. So for those who don't know, Spook has been working on tracking Russian casualties in Ukraine. Literally, in the same way, for those who are familiar with the work that Oryx is doing, where he gets photographs of lost equipment, Spook is searching all kinds of social media platforms for photos that show personnel losses, and trying to count them and catalog them so as not to count duplicates. Last I had heard, his group had counted several thousand casualties, which is impressive, and it complements sort of related efforts. For example, the BBC Russian service has been counting funeral notices and online death notices, and so Spook's project is similar, but obviously it's photographically evidenced. I will point out, so while in his call for volunteers, he does look for people to do geolocation and lots of other aspects of OSINT. I did message him just to say, hey, I know you've been looking at war casualties, but it sounds like this might be an expansion of the scope. And he said, well, no, it's still going to be counting casualties. So even if you do have these broader skills, just note that it sounds like it's the type of work that wouldn't suit everybody, and may take a psychological toll over time. But if it's the sort of thing that you're looking to work on, you can always reach out to Spook. The other 2 resources, one is there's a great site here, there's a great account here on Twitter called CatUXO for Unexploded Ordnance. And they do good work. And this post of theirs was interesting. I'll put this up in the nest separately. The post of theirs was interesting because they had said they had resisted putting out visual guides of different types of explosives, just because there are so many nuances, and the types being used in the invasion of Ukraine seemed like they were updating all the time. New munitions were being used, and they worried it would be incomplete. But I guess they've come to a point where they have said, we will produce some copies because there's such a large demining effort going on in Ukraine. It would be helpful to professionals who are doing that work. And so they have introduced the first of their guides. This one is just on hand grenades, but they do say that they will produce additional resources for landmines, mortars, projectiles, submunitions, and so on. So if you'd be interested in seeing those, you can always follow their account for when they publish them. The last resource this week is a report that's been put out by RUSI, and the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, of course, has been back in the news. There was some OSINT work done that showed fighting positions may have been established on the rooftops of some of the reactor buildings themselves. We may be chatting about that later on in our conversation today. So this makes this report timely, and it is looking at civilian nuclear infrastructure in the war in Ukraine. And I have only just had a chance to skim it, but it looks really interesting, so I'll be looking at it myself. As for podcasts in the last few days, again, not a lot, but some interesting ones. One was put on by the Irregular Warfare account, and I think this is a new effort from them. I don't recall them having done podcasts before this, but this apparently is their second episode. And they had some really well-known cyber folks in to talk about Russian cyber operations. But interestingly, not just from the February 2022 invasion, but going all the way back to 2014. And I think that they may have had guests on who were associated with SICE Johns Hopkins. And I know that we have folks around us. Many of you are probably familiar with Pyotr, who will host spaces on geopolitics. And he studied there and has, many of his guests come from that same school. So it's interesting that they had them on their podcast. The second of 4 podcasts was a new episode of War on the Rocks, which is on the use of AI in war. There was a written report that came out on this, quite an interesting article that I discussed in Spaces maybe 2 weeks ago. And now they've done a live podcast discussion on that same topic. Third item is it's a film. And so it's not exactly a podcast, but it's called 20 Days in Mariupol. And here, I'll put the first part of the tweet up in the nest. There's a link to an Associated Press article explaining the concept of the movie. But it was put together by a journalist with the Associated Press who was in Mariupol during the siege. And so it's, recommended by several people online. And the tweet that I put up noted that apparently it will be available to watch online on the Hot Docs webpage, but it won't be up until May the 5th, so just about a week from now. The final podcast was a new episode of the OSINT Bunker, which is a great show. They produce episodes, sometimes they have gaps between new production, but always interesting. This week, they were discussing Sudan and Haiti, and they had 2 sort of friends of our space who come to chat with us sometimes, Austin and Allsource, on as guests. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. I'll just quickly draw your attention. I won't talk through it all, but there is a slide up there. I think it's the 5th. It's right in the middle at the moment, the 5th from the left. That slide's titled Ukraine Overview. I always include this, but don't always speak to it. I like to collect together, a variety of maps, because particularly when the front line is moving faster than it has lately, it's good to see differences of opinion on control of terrain. And so I've included standard standard posts from the Institute for the Study of War, the War Mapper account, a link to Andrew Perpetua's YouTube presentation, which is always engaging. In this case, I've also put up an animation that was done by Konrad Muzyka, who does a Substack called the Ukraine. Apologies, it's escaping me, but it's like the Ukraine Monitor. and it's honestly one of the best and most detailed updates. Although he doesn't normally do maps along with it, but in this case, he's done an animation showing the shift in the front line, I believe, in the last year, or excuse me, the current year, back to January. I also included 2 discussion threads in here. The first is an interview with, I believe it was Reznikov, who was saying that, in his opinion, Ukraine is more than ready for its offensive. And then there was a thread put together by Mick Ryan, the Australian general, looking at how would we evaluate the success of the coming offensive. And that thread's generated some interesting responses. For example, Michael Kaufman weighed in and said, you know, it's going to come down to recaptured terrain, to the degree of damage inflicted on Russian forces, and then to perceptions in the West. But those are Kaufman's opinions. You might enjoy reading the thread and coming to your own conclusions about how to evaluate success. And then finally, before yielding the mic, I'll note that Friends of the Space have been kind enough to be streaming our conversation onto YouTube. I would always encourage you that if you'd like to participate, you do it here on Twitter. That way you can come up and chat with us or ask questions. But if you ever want to look back at conversations, or if you miss a discussion, you can go to the YouTube account where our conversations are archived. Okay. We have been over the last couple of weeks experimenting with the geolocation puzzles, and Exit has done great work in putting those puzzles together. We're playing with format a little bit, and so I think this past week, it was the first week where we had both hard and easier versions of the puzzles, and we've gone from 1 per space to just 1 per week in order to allow people a little bit more time to work on them. But huge thanks to Exit for putting those together, and I think that we have a guest who's going to walk us through solutions to the last puzzle, so I'll turn it over to Exit.
Thank you very much. And just a quick housekeeping. If you like what you hear here and you would like to bring others to the space, don't forget to retweet the space. You can do that down in the bottom right corner by hitting the little text box, and it'll bring up the tweet, and you'll be able to retweet that as well. And we do have Brad here to walk through his solving of the puzzle. But first, I'm going to start, sorry, Brad, one quick sec. I'm going to start with third back in the nest. You will see a post from GeoConfirmed. If you like geolocating, they are in desperate need of some help geolocating things in Ukraine. There is so much going on, and they just do not have all the people to do it all. So that post actually shows you how best to get the information back to them, a little instruction of how to do the geolocation, what information to save, what information to show them, and how to get that information back to them. So if you've been playing along with our treasure hunts and you've gotten decently good at this, try your hand at some real life events that are starting to happen that you see pass by your newsfeed, and send your answers to GeoConfirmed and help them out with their map. Thank you for that. And then we will now go back to second in the nest is the solution for this week's puzzle. And Brad solved this puzzle, which was great. So I'm going to start by reading out the hint or the clue, and then Brad's going to tell us what he did. So, and I'm only going to do the hard one. I won't do the easy, but the solution is in there for easy. So hard hint number 1 was, not all Japanese gardens are in Japan. Find me the Jardin Japonais just off Parana, which serves as an international border. And nobody make fun of my pronunciation there. It was probably horrible. Brad, how did you do it?
Well, there's a few things. Jardin Japonais is clearly a Spanish name, right? So we're dealing with the locations that's in a Spanish country. The Paraná River, which should have an accent on the last A, is very famous for being the border between three countries. And at one place, those three borders come together at the Falls of Iguazu. So it's a river, a very large river, that forms a border between Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And it's also very famous for an Academy Award movie called The Mission, which occurred near the Falls of Iguazu, which is that three-point border where all three countries come together. And there's a very famous scene where the Guarani tribe throws a Catholic priest tied to a cross over the Falls of Iguazu. Specifically, there's a point in the falls called the Devil's Throat, the Garganta del Diablo. So it's very, very famous if you're a film buff location, but it has nothing to do with this challenge, although we may see a connection to it later on in the quiz. So it's the Jardín Japonés is in Paraguay. It sits on the Paraná River, and it's the border between Paraguay and Argentina, and it's in the town of Encarnacion. You could spend tons of time trying to find a jardín, spelled with an M as in Mary, Japonés, which would be a Portuguese word. Potentially, you could find one in Brazil someplace, but you won't. You can find a Jardín Oriental, which was right near the Falls of Iguazu, but ultimately the Jardín Japonés is the one you're looking for. It's in Paraguay in Encarnacion, and it's right on the Paraná River, separating Paraguay from Argentina.
So thank you. And just a note, Brad, your volume is going in and out, so you might be a little bit muffled at times. Just to keep that in mind.
Okay.
So your second hint is cross two borders heading west-southwest, and the city you're looking for was founded in 189 years before the Academy Award-winning movie about a similarly named city was released. So can you tell me what tools you used to find that and how you got there?
Google Maps. That's it. You're just going south by southwest from Encarnacion. You cross two borders. So you're crossing one, which is the river, right? And then the next one you'll find is the border with Chile, right? And from there, you just look on the map. You're down south of Viña del Mar. You run into Casablanca, which is kind of obvious. And then you look it up, and it happens to be the right one. I mean, in theory, you could drop a list of every town within a certain region of Chile, and then you could cross-reference that with a database of every Academy Award-winning movie ever. But it's easier just literally look at the map and see the town Casablanca and look it up, and you're done.
Thank you. Your mic is still kind of funky, so I don't know if you can bring it a little closer.
Here, I'll go on speaker. Just a second.
Thank you. So the last hint was this region is known for. I can. That's perfect. Thank you. This region is known for its production of a beverage. Tell me which beverage and which varietal has the most acres planted. Extra points for a recommendation on your favorite from the region and the location for the producer.
Yeah.
And so tell us how you did that.
Sure. I don't drink, but that region is known for its vineyards. It's pretty famous for its vineyards. And so it's quite easy to look up Casablanca on Wikipedia and look up agriculture and production by basically agricultural production by acreage or hectare. And I'm trying to remember which was it. I sent you the answer. Was it? Hold on. It was
Chardonnay.
Chardonnay. That's right. And it's literally you just look at the acreage. You can find it just right on Wikipedia. It's fairly straightforward. What I thought was actually tricky about this whole affair was you had the Guarani tribe in Brazil which is related to the guarana seed, which is a very famous beverage. And you had the mission there. So there's a lot, if you overthink things, this is one of those cases where it's super easy to go astray if you just don't stick to things that are just like straightforward, right? So I felt like this is a really, really straightforward, pretty easy geolocation versus some of the other stuff where Mr. Bond has pulled out some really obscure databases, which were, you know, pretty interesting. But it's super easy to overthink stuff like this. A lot of times all I used, honestly, for all of this was just Google Maps. It was the only tool I needed, and Wikipedia.
That's awesome. Thank you for coming and letting us know how you did that. And that's a really, really good point that Brad points out, and that I often try and keep in mind when doing anything that we're looking at kind of on the internet, trying to find things. Most of the time, the easiest solution is the correct solution. And when you sit there and overthink it and try and come up with some harebrained scheme that allots for all of the different factors, you're almost always overthinking it and not likely to find the most obvious answer, which is usually the correct one.
Yeah, this was a 15 to 20 minute affair. Like it's pretty straightforward and not super fancy. But I'm in this because I do want to learn the fancy stuff. And so anyway, I think these are super fun.
Well, thank you. And this week's one, you gave me feedback that you would love to learn to use more tools. And so this week, the easy one is still fairly easy. The hard one is meant to bring out more tools. So I'm hoping that when you go to try and solve it, you'll have to use some tools you haven't used before and some pieces that we haven't used in these puzzles before. And hopefully that'll be a little bit harder for you. And you'll find that one up in the nest. It's the very first one in the nest right now. Thank you very much.
All right. And Exit, do we have easier and harder versions this week, or is it just a challenging one?
Nope, there is an easy one. And then there's the hard one, and there's actually a bonus from Shovel Girl. I don't know if she's here right now, but she sent me a really cool piece of geolocation trivia that she had found during the week from Ireland. And so you can actually go read through that. It's a fun little piece to read through and learn an interesting fact about Ireland.
Well, perfect. So thanks very much again to Exit for doing, preparing the puzzles, and thanks, Brad, for coming to explain. I do appreciate that we're now doing easier and harder. So if, you're sort of at the level of wanting to do a bit of a riddle that involves looking at some maps, that's probably about the level that the easy one will be at. And then the hard ones can get very tricky, having to look up some rather obscure details, most of which are applicable to some of the rare types of geolocation or research you might have to do for OSINT challenges. And I've also been told that our, maybe frequent champion who prefers to remain anonymous hadn't been able to work on the puzzle this last week. And so who knows, there might be, an opportunity to seize the crown. So if you come at these for competitive reasons, this might be the week to start. Okay, so we also have a guest who's graciously agreed to come and chat with us about some of his specialty, and that's David Helms. And so David has come to have conversation with us before. We actually, one of our very first spaces, we had David on to chat about his background in meteorology and how he would develop his forecasts, some of the tools he uses, and his special interest in the reservoir that is used for cooling for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and how there was risk at the draining of that reservoir. So that was a really interesting conversation that we had with David before. And he's back today to chat with us about weather conditions that he's been looking at and how they may affect the expected offensive, and then control of water resources in a couple of different regions in Ukraine. So, David, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael, for the invite. I guess the outline here is, the conditions, the weather conditions that are kind of setting the context of some of the offensive operations, the pace and the timing, some of the infrastructure issues that are perhaps underpinning some of the political imperatives that have been laid out by mostly Putin, and perhaps maybe a follow-up with the Kakova Reservoir, if we have time for that.
That sounds like a great outline to me. And just for record, for the listeners, if you have a look in the nest, you'll see put up first just a photo that demonstrates just how bad the mud season has remained, taken from just the last few days, where trucks are sinking up to their axles. I've also put up some posts from David, one of which is his most recent weather forecast. For those who aren't familiar with his work, he does extremely detailed posts, I think just about every day. And on that basis alone, he's worth a follow. But then I also put up some work that he's done looking at the moisture level in soil and how that affects sort of ability to travel across. So you can look at those materials while David explains to us, how weather may affect the offensive. So go ahead, David, and hope you don't mind if we have some questions. We'll just interject.
Absolutely. So end of March, I put out my first mud season analysis and prediction. So that was March 27th. And that work is a combination of material that was in the public domain that from the NATO reference mobility model guide, and there was some empirical indices on ground pressure associated with individual vehicle types and the strength of the soil to accommodate vehicles, that include a single vehicle of a certain ground pressure or multiple vehicles going over the same track. They came up with some indices, empirical indices, using volumetric soil moisture and cubic meters per cubic of moisture of water per cubic meter of soil in the top 10 centimeters of the soil. And more recently, there's been good work by, not only ASCAT microwave instrument, but also the SMAP instrument from NASA that actually drives land surface models that gives a solution for letting us know how much moisture is contained by the soil, the top level of the soil. So, but there's a lot of complexities and dealing with the data. Most of the data that's available that tells us about soil moisture is associated with agriculture and climate purposes. So there's a great deal of, it's one of those things, do you want it fast or do you want it good in terms of information? Most of the climate folks, they want it good. They don't need it fast. So there's a latency of 1 to 2 months, in fact, of some of the more high quality soil moisture analyses. There are quick looks, but they're somewhat noisy and maybe not exactly the indice I want, but
useful in terms of
trend analysis. At any rate,
David, can I ask
go ahead.
Can I just ask a quick question? So,
Yep.
Two things. Can I translate this into pretend I'm a 5-year-old and I'm not quite getting it? If I understand you correctly, so NATO puts out kind of numbers about this is how many vehicles can go across the ground in a specific area without causing damage or sinking in based on the soil moisture level. Is that part correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then the satellite moisture data, so they're measuring like rainfall and stuff, or how would a satellite measure that?
It's primarily emissivity. The dielectric constant of water is interesting. And so in the passive microwave and active microwave spectrum, the satellites see the emissivity of the soil changes fairly in a detectable way when as soil moisture changes incrementally. So we can do a retrieval and look at the brightness temperature of the soil at certain microwave wavelengths, and then transform that into soil moisture using some algorithms. So that's the satellite sees brightness temperature, and that correlates to through these retrievals to soil moisture.
And then the latency issues that you talked about, like obviously when planning something for military purposes or even otherwise, 1 to 2 months is a really long time to be off on your moisture. Mm-hmm. I know that for like agronomy, for agriculture, we have agronomists that go out and they test soil moisture levels, and they can get their results back like really quickly. They're doing it kind of on the fly. Would like military who are on the ground for something, would they be out testing moisture levels, or is that kind of just you're taking reports from people on the front line and you're not really actually testing, like getting real results for that?
I think in the old school, there might have been intelligence gathering through in situ, human sources. There's actually a gauge, a cone index gauge that you shove into the ground, and you measure the resistance. And in a tactical way, you could there's little kits that you put on a backpack, and then you hump it into the gray zone, and then you collect those data. But nowadays, that's a pretty risky thing to do. So I think most of the data are gathered in remote sensed from satellite data primarily, and then unlike I'm sitting here waiting for the latest ERA 5 reanalysis or FLDAS NASA surface land model updates. The military has their own land surface models they run with the latest data and probably some proprietary / military eyes only data that they have that the public doesn't see. So they're running their models in near real time. They're getting an answer probably within days anyway. The thing about soil moisture, you think about agriculture, you mentioned, it doesn't change overnight. There was a big storm that happened in late March in Donbass, and that contributed an amazing amount of water to the ground. So there are exceptions, and the conditions in Luhansk and Donetsk really changed pretty dramatically in a negative way for offensive operations because of that storm. But for the most part, things are pretty stable, and as long as the real problem for understanding what's going to happen in the future is it's really knowing how much rain is going to fall, and meteorological models are notoriously bad at getting a fairly accurate quantitative precip or even probabilistic precip forecast beyond a week or two. So you go by climatology, you go by your initial condition, and then you kind of run some scenarios. Well, what if we get this much or that much? And how does that affect our operational plan? So, so I answered, my response is, one, they run in real time or near real time with satellite data primarily. I'm sure they calibrate it with some in situ, with some human intel, and what's coming in, from video through Telegram, etc. But as far as planning, they're at the mercy of the precipitation forecast when you're thinking about in the future. But the good news is the soil moisture as a quantity is fairly stable. And if you look at what has happened over the last 20 years with the soil moisture in this area, it's for the most part pretty predictable month over month. It does dry out. It will be solid enough for offensive operations. The question is, plus or minus a week or two, what's in fact going to happen. And that I originally issued, my first forecast on March 27th, that the big winter storm proceeded to snow and rain like hell. And at the end of March. And then I think I track it kind of little calibration points just for my own benefit. Crimea is one place I look at. And I think they got about 80% more precipitation for the month of April. Here we are, April 30th, than that they're used to. They usually get around 40 millimeters of rain. They got about 70 millimeters of rain. And let me check that. 71 millimeters is what my guesstimate is. And I don't have a rain gauge sitting in Luhansk. I'm using satellite-based well, if the key is precipitation, how do I know how much it rains? I look at the microwave and infrared satellite data. So the coolness of the tops of the clouds can be translated by a lot of science and a lot of empirical data to rainfall rates. And so you get over time, plus or minus some error bar, a daily amount of rainfall, plus, you're going to get bits and pieces of information to help you give some confidence in what you're seeing and what the analysis is. So between short-term models, whether real-time nowcasts and satellite quantitative precip estimates, you get a pretty good sense of how much rain is falling, and to give a sense of, and ultimately I redid my weather or my soil moisture prediction on it was April 25th, I believe, and I came up with the basically I moved everything back by about 1 month. Initially it had been drier than normal in the south, in Zaporizhia and Kherson, but then they too got some rain. But the most recent weather models, we see about 10 to 15 days into the future, and I just looked at this morning's forecast, and basically there's very little rainfall predicted. Typically in a week or every week we get about maybe 6 to 10 millimeters in these oblasts, and there's almost none over the next 10 to 15 days, and that will definitely dry the soil out and make it strong enough to begin to hold offensive operations. And I see there's another question.
Yeah, so just before going to the question, for the audience, I'll note, as David has been referring to sources here, I've put a few more items in the nest, including one of David's tweets about the website Meteorologics, which he seems to use for preparing his reports. I just opened that site up, and it's very interesting. It seems to consolidate quite a lot of satellite options, imagery options. And I just typed in Bakhmut, Ukraine, and I can look at various versions of satellite imagery from there. So that's the sort of thing that even if you're a layman, you can have a look at and sort of dip your toes into. The other item I put in the nest was a tweet from the Copernicus satellite, which runs that ERA5 report that David referred to. So if you want to begin learning more about that, you can always follow them here on Twitter. I think it was Jacoby first, and then we'll go to Exit. Jacoby, go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, David. I'm so glad to hear you in this space and talking about this, particularly now. It's so timely. And I wonder if you have a way of comparing what is being experienced in Ukraine and what people may be used to, military members of the military might be used to in Russia, and why, if it's similar or if it's different. And that's one of the reasons it's worth remarking on the muddy situation that people encounter in Ukraine.
So I think the question, Jacoby, is, are the Russians going to be experienced, or the soil strength trafficability in a different way from what, say, Ukraine or the West experience maybe? Is that your question?
You said it much more artfully than I did, but essentially, yeah.
I think the physics of the, I mean, you think about the vehicles that the Russians use versus what Ukrainians have. Of course, many times they use the same vehicles, but even the Western vehicles that are coming in, let's say the Humvee, it's a wheeled vehicle. It has a certain mass. It has 4 wheels. The mass divided by 4 over the surface area of the wheel. Each wheel that has a certain geometry tells you what the force per unit area is, and it's just physics. So I think both forces are going to use tracked vehicles, be it 113s or Challengers or what have you, or T-70, T-55s. Again, the track, the beauty of a track and why there are tracks is because you have a heavy armored vehicle. We put tracks on those things that somebody brilliant figured out. If you spread out that mass over a much larger area, the actual unit force is less than a wheeled vehicle. So this is, but you're not going to go into battle and either defend or to try and do a breakthrough with just tracked vehicles. You need to have supply trucks. You need fuel trucks. You need all the logistics tail running close behind you. And some of those trucks are going to be very massive, maybe 10 wheels. And the reason why we have 10 wheels and not 4 or 6 or 8 is because you want to distribute that weight. So I think ultimately physics is the same for everybody, and the geometry. I think the mix of tracked and wheeled vehicles is similar on both sides. And I think there might be some advantage on how you plan your operation, your thrust to perhaps maximize trafficability. And I think, the bottom line is you want to move fast. The faster you can move, it's the OODA loop thing. The faster you move with your logistics tail in tow, the harder it is for the bad guys to try and target you, bring their weapons on target, and then take you out. So, mobility, it's not just yes, no for the mud. It's degrees of gray. You want to move as fast as possible to take out, the critical positions and, basically checkmate your enemy. So I think the degree of planning and the mix of vehicles and being smart about, and part of the engineering element is, overcome all those trenches and all those fortifications while dealing with, mud. So I think that's where, I hope that the Ukrainians and their support and the reach back to the Western intelligence agencies is going to give them an edge. Does that help?
That's great. Exit, did you want to go ahead with your question?
So I'm kind of along the same lines. Are there parts of Ukraine where the mud is going to be worse than others? Or maybe are there specific types of mud that are worse than others? And you might not know the mud part.
I start with what is the soil type across the line of conflict, and there's forest and a little bit of sand up in the Donetsk River area, but not a lot. And there's some forest, but predominantly it's going to be agriculture fields, and those agriculture fields are predominantly Chernozem, the black soil. And that's kind of a mix of silty loam and texture. So generally speaking, the soil across the line of conflict is very similar. But what differs is, I think, how warm and how dry and how windy the conditions are along the line of conflict, and the initial conditions. So it's been drier over the winter in Zaporizhia and Kherson, although they did get a bit of rain this past month, and more moist than Donetsk and Luhansk. So my forecast indicates a 1 month transition from offensive operations, soil strength supporting offensive operations that begins, about mid-May in the south, in Zaporizhia and Kherson. And then I have this kind of intermediate place in south of the Donetsk River, and north of Donetsk. It kind of frees up in 2 weeks after that, around, towards mid to end of May. And then lastly, Luhansk is really the final place where I think, because it's going to be a little more moisture up there, it's going to be not as warm. And so the evaporation, I also have a thread on green up or leaf unroll. Again, the growing degree days, exit, as you know, your agriculture information, growing degree days with a base of about 5 degrees C is a lot. There's accumulation of energy and heat in the south that forces the leaves and the vegetation to start. The transpiration in the vegetation helps remove moisture from the soil. The heat and the lower humidity from higher temperatures in the daytime helps remove moisture from the soil. So those kind of removal of moisture happens at a faster rate and in the south than it will in the northeast. And so that's why I have that kind of a rolling prediction that's kind of a differential of a month from mid-May to mid-June from southwest to northeast. Does that make sense?
It does. And I noted when you said that they receive typically 6 to 10 mils per week, I was thinking, man, I can understand why agriculture in that area is so productive, because we dream of that kind of consistent moisture. And we are not blessed with that where I live. And that would
But you have lower your evaporation in central southern Canada. You guys, the thing is, it's not how much precip you get, it's how arid it is. And what is the hydrology water budget? And the thing about south and eastern Ukraine is it is arid. They have a net deficit of moisture. They lose more moisture than they get generally seasonally year over year. Although there's obviously times when they have more than they receive more precipitation than they give up to the atmosphere from the ground. So it depends on that budget of evapotranspiration and infiltration. And that tells you what happens with the soil. Also, a lot of organic material is in the Sierra Nezen as well. So I think that's the difference between Canada, southern Canada, central Canada, and this location is, I think it's a lot more arid, a lot warmer, and a lot drier in general, in terms of evapotranspiration.
And so David had just referred to a thread that he put out on the vegetation. He used the phrase leaf unroll. And I'll admit I follow David, but I hadn't seen that thread when he came out. So I've put that up in the nest as well, as you may all be interested in that. Before going back to exit, I have one or two of my own questions. So I presume, David, that besides the absorption of all this moisture by the soil, are we in for a period of some weeks where the volume of rivers will be considerably higher? Because river crossing has obviously been an issue in this war in the past. Are we expecting that to be more challenging even once the soil firms up?
I follow the Ukraine Meteorological Center, and I actually, in the thread that I put out that on April 17th, April 20, on Kokova Reservoir, I include a link to the Hydrometeorological Center, and they issue warnings on river rise, and that are and they actually have some watches out for the Servi Donetsk River now, and there has been, as we talked about, 80% more rainfall than normal for April. The rivers in the east are higher than normal, and there has been quite a bit of rainfall and a quick snowmelt in Belarus in the upper Dnipro, and that kind of accelerated the spring water season, if you will, in the hydrologic sense on the Dnipro, and so we're seeing tremendous amount of water coming down into the lower Dnipro now, and we can talk about that if you want. But just to answer your question, absolutely, for the next month, it is, as this water kind of drains, through the major river systems, particularly the Servo, the Donetsk River, that you're going to have to bring those bridges. Those creeks will not be at a minima. They will probably be closer to There are seasonal highs, if not at their highs, in the next several weeks, and any plan that thinks about bridging operations it will have to deal with that. Absolutely.
Thanks for that. And one more question before I go to exit is we saw the Ukrainians use tactics around Kiev where they would flood some regions as a defensive mechanism. And so when you were talking about the soil, trafficability, it occurred to me, I wonder whether that is an element that could play into the offensive with the Russians using that as a tactic. Short of we spoke with you previously about the risks to the Nova Kakhovka Dam, but maybe laying that aside, because it's more arid in the south, are you aware of any potential for the Russians to try to use flooding as a delay tactic?
Well, I think it was the actual Ukrainians that flooded the Oskol River during the retreat in the spring of 22. And there was around Kyiv, as you said, there was some deliberate flooding of some dams and some retaining. If we think about, I think the rivers run mostly north to south in Luhansk. There might be, if there was a thrust up on north of the Donetsk river, that might be a problem. But it's pretty arid as we get around and south of Donetsk, the city of, and into towards Mariupol, and so I wouldn't imagine that would be a larger scale problem. I would point out that there are, and maybe it's not been talked about too much, is the large amount of probably thousands of kilometers of irrigation systems, some of which are, and I saw that even in Bakhmut right now, they're kind of laying up along the canal that is actually the main canal that comes down from the Donetsk. It's the Donetsk-Donbass canal that goes down to Donetsk itself. It feeds the primary water source that used to provide water to the southeast. And again, that's a topic that you want to talk about. But it's clear that the reservoirs, or rather the irrigation facilities, could be used, integrated with the defensive positions. There are hundreds and thousands of kilometers of irrigation canals that could be a problem. That as an offensive operation planning takes place, they'll have to account for those as barriers, and they could be used if they were flooded and filled up. But the problem with actually filling up the irrigation canals and say the left bank in Kherson, outside of the NCC, the North Crimean Canal itself, which is gravity fed. Everything else is fed by, all the other canals are generally, you need pumps. And between infrequent or absence of power, those pumps are offline. And because they haven't been running, they probably been, with lack of maintenance, they probably wouldn't work now anyway. So probably it's the irrigation in terms of barriers. The canals themselves pose a challenge. But other than that, I wouldn't expect the rivers, because basically I think the offensive operations will be going in the south from north to south, and the rivers generally run north to south. So they'll be running in parallel. and there isn't tremendous amount of water reservoirs and so on in eastern Kherson and Zaporizhia. So probably not a major problem. But if that is a problem, it would be in the Luhansk, I believe.
Okay, well, thanks for that answer on the question about flooding as a defensive tactic. And you did start to get into other matters I hope to chat about briefly in a minute. But before we go there, I'll ask Exit to come in.
I actually have a question from the audience, and then I had one or two of my own. But the question from the audience was they were wondering if you are in contact with any soil hydrologists that are in Ukraine.
I'm afraid I'm not. I mean, I follow the Ukrainian Hydrologic Center's predictions, but I don't know specific information or have insider information to Ukrainian scientists.
I wonder, Exit, whether Mike Lee, who is an agronomist who we had chat with us about a month ago, might have any connections. Like, is that the sort of thing you'd like to be able to reach out to somebody in Ukraine? Would that help?
It would be useful to get some feedback for sure.
Okay, that's a good question. Exit, keep going.
I will definitely reach out to Mike, and if there's anybody else in the space that has connections to hydrologists in Ukraine, by all means, reach out to me, and we'll try and put everybody together. So then I have two kind of big questions. Is there important background that as a lay person I wouldn't know or wouldn't understand when I'm looking at these things that I should kind of keep in mind as I'm watching all of the things happen in the next couple months?
As far as soil conditions, or specifically, what do you have in mind, Exit?
So from a military standpoint, is there anything that I should kind of like larger things that I should be watching for? And then just generally soil conditions and water in general, is there things that I should be watching for in the next couple of months?
I would just pay attention to the precipitation. That's the primary, again, are we going to get more precipitation than normal or less precipitation than normal? And ultimately that will lead to either, continued marginal soil moisture / strength, high moisture, lower strength. And so I think the key really is just, how much rain are we getting on really kind of on a weekly basis, not on a daily basis, and pay attention to that. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thank you. The other thing that I was wondering is, are there questions that people should be asking that you just don't hear people thinking about?
Questions people should be asking. I guess, the environmental shaping of the battlefield is it, I just don't see a lot out there. And maybe it's the vehicles and the maybe it's all weather. Maybe the planning is they've kind of engineered a lot of that out of the problem. But I suspect, I did a series of explainers on weather sensitivities to the commercial UAVs, drones, in the early winter, because visibility and light conditions and rainfall all affect the operations and the performance of what they're trying to do. And one reason why I kind of did the Leaf Unroll is, all these great, views of, you see these drones identifying, tracking, and attacking, folks on the ground, troops on the ground, with some cover that's happening soon. That dynamic changes. The effectiveness of the drones, that are primarily relying on visible, in some cases thermal, that's going to be harder to track. Some of these snipers that are picking up, targets, a long way off, as the grass grows, as the fields kind of, get a meter or more of vegetation, it's going to be tougher to track. And so that allows for better stealth. And, perhaps, if you're, using that to your advantage, again, the environment will help you.
Okay, well, thanks for that back and forth question and answer. I know we do have one more question from the audience. Just as a point on timing, it's great that we've gone into these questions in this level of detail. David is a wealth of knowledge. I had talked to David about the potential to discuss water access in Crimea, and also the what's the name of the canal? The Donetsk Canal. But I suspected that topic alone might take another half an hour. And so what I might do is say that since David is such a crowd pleaser, maybe we can have David back in a couple of weeks, because those items aren't as time sensitive. And that way we'll spread out this watery goodness over a couple of weeks. But we do have one more question anyway from the audience. And if you have any questions, this is sort of your call to come up with them for David. I'm going to get Aaron back up. He dropped, but once Aaron is back, Aaron, did you want to go ahead with your question for David? Aaron was just joining the stage, but Aaron, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. David, nice to meet you. I'm Aaron Boma, military analyst and host of the Bauma Report and military historian. I wanted to ask, what do you think the timeline? I mean, do you think, as far as, I don't want to speculate too much, because on the counteroffensive that we might be seeing, we suspect it's going to probably be the dry season, right? And then maybe you guys were already talking about that, but the dry season is coming, of course, in the summer, with very similar to of course, when the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa, it was June 22nd, and that was when, of course, the muddy season was pretty much ending, or so to say. And what do you think on of course, what we call the Rasputitsa, or have you guys talked about that already? Just wondering.
So Aaron, that was what we discussed for the last 20 minutes or so. So okay. we may not go back into it, but we are recording. So if you're keen to hear David's thoughts on that, the recording, we'll post when we wrap up in about 2 hours. But it's a great question, and we had the same thoughts. And I think the bottom line David gave us is that there is some very low precipitation forecast, which may lead to, after nearly double precipitation in the last couple of weeks, it may lead to a slightly faster drying out than would be normal. But that it may still be a couple of weeks, and that if you have a look in the nest, there is one chart where David starts it with BLUF for bottom line up front. It's the 6th or 7th item back in the nest, and he has a breakdown with sort of probability by date and by region, because it does vary by region. So hopefully that helps answer some of your questions.
Yes, thank you so much.
Of course.
All right, thanks so much.
Shovel Girl, go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon, or hello everybody around the world. This is just a suggestion for David. My question was the one about if you had been able to speak to any soil hydrologist. Thanks, Exit, for asking. But I just wanted to help you a little bit. So, some advice for anybody that's trying to do research specifically on certain things. I always get a lot of good results if I just plug it in to like Google Translate. Pick some of those keywords that your field has or that you would expect to find, and you can unveil a whole new world of connections. Because there are a lot of groups of people who specialize in scientists, and you might be able to tap into that and really be able to find a whole lot more information. So I just wanted to suggest that to you, David, and anybody else that's doing research. Don't be afraid to try to tackle that language barrier. And a lot of times Ukrainians are very open and willing to translate back.
Well, Shovel Girl, your question was a great one because it inspired us that we may know people who can sort of put David in touch pretty directly. But,
that's awesome. Yeah. Excited.
Sorry, David, did you want to comment at all on that?
I appreciate the suggestion. I have a significant amount of done research, and I tried to identify Ukrainian scientists and sources. So I have part of the problem is trying to I live on primarily Twitter, and of course many folks in Ukraine are on Telegram. So there's a bit of it's not necessarily language that's the problem, and I do certainly use Google Translate a lot. But I think it's just kind of a communication protocols that are a bit of a problem. But certainly, if through this conversation, if we get some contacts, that would be great. And I appreciate your feedback.
So for a last question for David, we'll go to Dean.
Yeah, I'm not sure how appropriate it is to ask a question, so I'll make an observation. During the harrying of the North, back in around 1069 or something like that, William the Bastard, later called the Conqueror, ran into a situation, and he was interested in pursuing the situation in the northeast of England very aggressively. And despite the worst weather and mud that was just unbelievable, he pressed harder than ever. And it turns out that while it was a very difficult and costly measure for him, it was more costly for those he was going after. And that's part of military history. I couldn't help but thinking, as I was listening to this, that somebody in one of the planning offices might be thinking about that. I don't know if they'll do anything with it. I think it's inappropriate for us to comment on it here. I just want to point out that there is a really interesting footnote with some strong parallels. Check.
Well, that's interesting because it did occur to me. I wasn't sure how to phrase the question, but it's a good question whether in modern warfare, wet, somewhat impassable conditions would be more of a burden to the attacker or to the defender, but that may even go down to tactics and understanding of the terrain, and and so I off the top of my head, I wouldn't know. I'd imagine we'd need somebody to come in, who is sort of at the operational command level.
That was called the harrying of the North. Look that up.
Sure. So I don't know, David, if you have any thoughts on whether it imposes more costs on the attacker or defender?
I think if you're dug in and you've got your well supported, with eyes on, and you've got your defensive fortifications there. If the attacker is slowed down and you're become a target for longer and within the killing zone, that's not a good thing for the offensive side. And if the Ukraine can figure out how to keep moving despite sinking in the mud, and maybe they think about, well, we're only going to attack in this particular location at this maybe a preemptive strike. We're only going to use track vehicles. I mean, I think there's got to be some, if you're going to go ahead and catch let's say the Russians, waiting for the perfect conditions in, late June or something, and you wanted to go now, let's say, you probably wouldn't take your heavy, 4 and 6 wheel vehicles and think that those are going to keep up with you. They're not. So, it would depend on the mix that you would try and go forward with.
Okay. Thanks for that. And David, thanks very much for coming to chat with us again. Hopefully you don't mind that we are going to push the 2 canal questions down the road a little bit, but if you would be open to coming back and chatting with us again in a couple of weeks, we'd love to get into that. And did you have any parting thoughts?
I just appreciate the conversation and exchange. So thanks for having me.
And so I would encourage everybody to check out David's work. And I think he's worth a follow for sure. And I think that he's a great example of somebody who has, detailed knowledge in a focused area and is, really applying it consistently. And I know there are several among us who take that approach. But I definitely think that is if everybody takes their area of focus, then the whole group is enriched by quite a lot. I guess before moving on, we have a new speaker. Karen, did you want to come in with a comment? One more time, Karen. If you want to come in, you may be muted. Okay, Karen may be away from the mic. That's no problem. I'll move on. Just before.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead, Karen.
Okay, this is the first time I've done this, so it's new. I have a question. The Black Sea contains the largest amount, largest reservoir of hydrogen sulfide in the entire world. Is there a possibility that this could be used to produce hydrogen soon to alleviate some of Ukraine's energy problems next winter?
First of all, welcome to the space. I always appreciate new speakers. That's a pretty detailed question that I'll admit I don't know the answer to, because I imagine it would depend a lot on the economics of hydrogen extraction. And I know that Ukraine as a territory has access to, there's lots of coal in the Donbass region. There's lots of natural gas in the Black Sea. So I don't know how heavily they are investing in hydrogen infrastructure. If anybody who is a current speaker has any insight into that, you're welcome to chime in. But otherwise, we may I'll go ahead, engineer.
Other than being able to confirm what you said, I wouldn't anticipate Ukraine spending lots of money on energy infrastructure for converting hydrogen to usable fuel, or hydrogen sulfide to usable fuel. So I imagine they're probably going to spend it on homemade rockets instead.
So that's a great point. I hadn't had eyes on that question, so I'll keep my eyes out for any discussion of it. What I will say is that certainly by, due to the unfortunate circumstances of the invasion, a lot of eyes have been turned on Ukraine that had not been paying close attention there before. And so whether it's hydrogen or other resources, I suspect that as the situation there stabilizes and they begin to rebuild their economy, that they'll have lots of support for new initiatives, whether it be hydrogen or otherwise, because there are a lot of people who will appreciate the potential there who might have overlooked Ukraine before. But Gurney's come up, so he may have an answer.
Well, I was just going to indirectly answer this here, Michael. And just to say, those last I checked, those, I can't pronounce it here, Cherno those gas rigs in the Black Sea, if you guys remember, they were used for Russian special ops were using them as a base, and Ukraine had attacked them. Those have been burning on the firm's data since last summer. So just to answer this indirectly, I doubt there's going to be any production in the Black Sea anytime soon, seeing how those platforms that were in existence haven't even been occupied since then, and the fires are still burning on them. So just due to the fact that that's a contested area, I doubt you're going to see any economic activity.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And Karen, thanks for your question. I know that it's, this is a probability response, but hopefully give you some insight.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so in programming for the show, I have, sort of tools and resources. We try to get a guest in. We will discuss some current events in a little while. Just before moving to sort of our background issue, which is sort of an issue of either you want to call it direct espionage or transnational repression. Just before that, I wanted to highlight a handful of examples from the last few days of what I think are good OSINT posts, because I like to work in the OSINT angle so that we don't forget that is a lens through which we're trying to interpret the news. And so if you have a look up in the nest, I've put a few examples. I'll populate one or two more in a moment. The first item there, it doesn't relate to Ukraine, but it was in the news that through Freedom of Information Act requests in the United States, the Washington Post got access to more than 900 new photographs of the day that I believe the raid on bin Laden's hideout occurred. The reason I'm putting this one up is because it was as a result of a Freedom of Information Act application, I believe by this account, FOIA Nate. And first of all, it caught my eye because the way they've compiled the photos into a video presentation was eye-catching. But then it made me think, that's one aspect of open source investigation that we haven't discussed in the space, and that is freedom of information requests. And it's not just the United States. Many countries have, similar laws in place. And just to mention that if anybody who's listening has any professional experience in making requests under these sorts of public disclosure laws, that it would be interesting to maybe hold a session to describe how they work, the cost, the types of persistence that are required in order to make them effective. And so I just wanted to put it out there to the group that if you have experience with freedom of information requests, please let me know, and we'll try and set up a conversation about it in the future. I've added a few more items to the nest, so it's shifted around a little bit, but I wanted to highlight another aspect. We've had some conversations lately about ham radio use and sort of signals intelligence at the amateur level. And so the tweet that's up there by JD Work is interesting to me. Some of you may know that there was a lander that was attempting to be put onto the moon, I believe by a Japanese company. And this account noted, so that lander failed. They lost contact with it. a few moments before it was to make contact, and it's believed to have been lost. And interestingly, it's a commercial product, and it had been transmitting in bands that can be heard by amateur radio operators around the world. And so they were listening in on the band, and they could tell the moment that it failed, which is really interesting. Just exploring the idea of this potentially being one of the first examples of OSINT possible use on a body other than the Earth. And, because obviously people interact via radio with the International Space Station and with satellites, but in terms of activity on the moon, this was the first example I had heard of. And so I wanted to highlight it here. The second item in the nest, we've discussed in the space for various reasons, the use of illegal ship-to-ship transfers of oil to get around, it has economic implications, it has, security implications. And this was a good article that was put together by the Financial Times on ships passing through the Kerch Strait, which are carrying, prohibited goods or oil, for example, that would be subject to the otherwise subject to the oil price cap. And since their intention is to, cross into waters where they can then meet up with another ship and offload the oil so that it looks like it's from a foreign source, they're turning their AIS systems off. And so it's sort of obvious in the data now that particularly around the Kerch Strait, where it's a bottleneck that these ships pass through, the AIS is being turned off. This will tie in, I may mention it later on, but having seen this, some politicians are now suggesting that any ship that is seen turning off its AIS, not just in the Kerch Strait, but sort of around the world, if they turn off those systems with more than a certain frequency, and I'm not sure what that frequency would be exactly, that automatically their owners would then be added to sanctions lists. And this is the idea of, we're going to sanction you, not necessarily because we see you committing the crime, but because we see you taking actions that look like they're attempting a cover-up. And so I thought this was an interesting bit of open source investigation. Exit, go ahead.
This kind of ties into something we've seen commented on by Lloyd's List and a couple of other people who cover shipping, who have noted that insurance companies and others who provide services to shippers are starting to really think about how those people present information. And so it's no longer about are you evading sanctions? It's more about now, can you prove to me that you aren't evading sanctions? Because otherwise, I just don't want to work with you. It's not worth my time and my effort to prove that you're not evading sanctions. And so we're starting to see a whole bunch of those service suppliers or service providers, kind of stop providing for people who are not providing that information freely. And I expect that that's kind of the trend that we're going to continue to see, which in some ways is a really good thing, but it also will eventually kind of create a black market for ships that are going to operate outside of all of those services. And how you go and enforce all of that will be an interesting question that I don't think anybody has the answer to right now.
I agree. We'll have to keep our eyes on it. Kitty, go ahead.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Exit. Would you have something that says which insurers are starting to do that now?
The articles I read didn't actually name the insurers as of yet, but I could try and find the Lloyd's comment about that. I'll see if I can find back for that.
Engineer, go ahead.
I imagine Lloyd's would be one of them. There's very few. Turns out shipping insurers are not like the most widely, it's not the most competitive market. It's quite capital intensive. You need, basically you're underwriting thousands, millions of pounds worth of ship in one go. So yeah, if one of those goes bang for whatever reason, and or the cargo is really what you're underwriting. It's not so much the ship. Sometimes the cargo, if you think about a container ship, the cargo may be worth essentially the same as the ship that's carrying it. For some cargoes, potentially more than the vessel that is carrying it. The insurer is also backing up, covering the cost of, particularly for oil or gas, predominantly oil, the cost of cleaning up the mistake if someone happens to spew their entire cargo out. So, yeah, you've got to have a lot of cash. You're not going to be. It's quite hard to run a backyard underground. Well, yeah, you need state backing if you're going to do this illicitly, and that may end up being what happens.
I hadn't realized until the last few months that the protection and indemnity, they're like mutual insurance clubs, and I believe there are 9 major ones around the world. So it's actually a fairly tightly integrated industry. It was kind of fascinating to learn about. Exit, go ahead.
My brain just blanked, and we'll go to Kitty. Sorry.
Are governments putting pressure on these insurers now, or what is it that has them stepping in finally? Because there's just so many invasions happening.
Exit, I think, was first, and then engineer.
Partially, it's the decisions that the G7 is making about transparency, and it's more about them starting to take steps to actually do something about sanctions invasions and enforcing it. As soon as they start asking questions, then the insurers and others who have to answer those questions and have to put time and effort and a lot of money into finding the answers and the proof for those questions. That's when you start to see that happening. So this week in particular, the last 2 weeks, I guess, we've seen different governments come out and start enforcing sanctions, and that's really what's putting the pressure on them.
Engineer.
Yeah, kind of. I'll back that up as well. It basically it will be pretty effective, because these 9 institutions will all operate in capital-intensive markets. So London is a big one, no doubt. There will be other kind of major insurance markets, I think, but they'll all be based out of 1 or 2 different places. So the UK and likely the US, maybe somewhere else in the Western world. That means that these governments will basically be able to turn around and say, prove to us that you're not basically underwriting sanctions evasion or else. And it will almost certainly drive us to a situation where Western companies will be forced to abide by these sanctions, because if your tanker or whatever that you've been tied to you that isn't insured, all of a sudden they will start suing the companies who can be tied to these operations. And if they don't have insurance because because they're uninsured, because the insurers won't underwrite these vessels because they suspect they won't be operating legitimately or can't provide evidence that they're operating legitimately, that will be very messy very quickly. So I'd anticipate that to be the direction of travel. Surprised it's taken this long, but it is very achievable given the kind of constraints of the market.
It's also that many of the insurers that exist in Western countries who are already enforcing these rules directly, like the G7 price cap, for example, they can simply be fined by the governments that they're subject to. The reason you need to start adding these ship-owning companies, if they're clearly trying to evade, to a sanctions list, is that you can't punish them directly. And by putting them on the sanctions list, that means none of the citizens of your jurisdiction can deal with them. So that is the punishment. So it's just that because you can't reach out and regulate them directly, your only available mechanism is to limit, their access to capital and banking and so on. Exit, go ahead.
Sorry, the only other thing I was going to say that I had forgotten, I think you'd be surprised how many ships operate in certain areas without insurance. I particularly had some conversations with people this week, about operations that happened without insurance that I wasn't aware of. And that's just not something you're necessarily going to hear about until something goes wrong, because there isn't generally a worldwide way of enforcing that. And so that's kind of the bigger problem, is that while there are international groups that are supposed to enforce these kinds of things and make sure that it happens, there really isn't the amount of enforcement that you would hope for. And in shipping specifically, stuff happens all the time that does not go reported and does not go insured, and people just move on and keep going.
Kitty, did you want to come in with the last point on this, and then we'll keep going?
Yeah, just wondering if you were able to, anybody told you which states are the biggest offenders in that area?
Sorry, can you clarify that a little bit more?
Yeah, the uninsured ships that you said, we'd be surprised at how many they're doing.
That's a really difficult question to answer for a couple of reasons. Ships can be insured by one state. They can be flagged under another state. They can change flags at the whim, basically, of the ship owner. They are owned by companies that are not necessarily in the flagged countries. The ship captains and ship crews are not necessarily of the same country as where the ship is from or where it's flagged. There's kind of not really an answer to that. And there's lots of ships that your better question would be, where does the cargo come from that might evade sanctions or might avoid things like shipping insurance? And typically, cargo comes from places that have conflicts. So any country that has a conflict or any region that has a conflict is typically where those cargoes are coming from.
And I know you didn't exactly mean it this way, Kitty, but when you say who are the biggest offenders at running ships uninsured, I'll just point out that whether it's an offense or not would depend on the jurisdiction and whether you need insurance to come into port and so on, but that there are plenty of places that would operate ships under a self-insurance model, which is just, if the ship goes down, I bear the cost. And that's certainly not the sort of commercial standard, but it doesn't mean that there are like global rules that mandate insurance. It would be jurisdiction specific. So I didn't expect that to be a conversation, but I'm glad that's an example of, if people have questions, let's get into it. So two last points, just as examples of interesting OSINT from the last few days. I moved them to the front of the nest. They're the first two items. So one of them is a tweet by Eric Toller. This one I thought was funny. It turns out that for some reason, if you get a traffic ticket in Moscow, all of those are publicly available, including if it was, via some kind of a traffic light camera. The photographs are available. And you'd think a country that's at war might, considering that Russia reported this week that it is no longer going to publish production figures for oil and gas, if you're clamping down on information at that extremely important level, but you're still putting out all of the photographs of your traffic cams. It strikes me as being a bit imbalanced. But as a result, Eric noticed that the son of Dmitry Peskov, who is the Kremlin's spokesperson, the story came out last week that his son had gone off to fight with Wagner. And I think they claimed he was in an artillery unit for several months, and Prigozhin backed him up on that. And some people had said, oh, well, this is, just cover to show that the elites are sending their children as well. Well, because of the traffic cams, Eric discovered that Peskov's Tesla, and it's understood he's the only owner of it, was driving around and getting traffic tickets in Moscow during the period that he said he was out fighting with Wagner. And, that's not 100% definitive, but it certainly suggests that maybe that was, some propaganda for an internal audience, as opposed to an honest report that he had gone off to fight. The last item in terms of interesting OSINT, and this will be for any of the flight trackers among us. I'll admit I don't understand it completely, but a lot of people will use websites like Flight Radar and ADSB Exchange. And then, of course, there are new entrants to the flight tracking data market, like the ACARS project. We had a conversation with the Bald Geek some weeks ago. But often it's difficult to tell whether a flight is a military flight or not. And so in order to track that, most of the flight trackers who do it very intensely, they keep lists of, tail numbers. They keep lists of call signs that are typically military, and that's how they recognize them. In this case, it's a user who said what he did was to sort the flights that were up by hex ID, and then look for whether they were transmitting on TISB. And now this is, I'll admit, where I get over my head in terms of the technicalities of flight tracking. But in any event, he suggested that if TISB is transmitting, and then the aircraft is flying at more than 250 knots, then it's very likely to be a military flight. And I thought that was interesting. I don't know whether this is, it sounds like a new trick to try to filter. But I brought this up because in speaking with the Bald Geek, he was explaining that even in the ACARS data, there's so much data, but sometimes, unless you're an expert following this, you don't have insight into how to track it most meaningfully. And so when these tips come forward, people who are building the data systems appreciate these sorts of things. So I wanted to bring that to the group in case you might be a flight tracker and want to use this as a tip, and also to use it as an excuse to remind you that if you have your own tips that are fairly new, or in particular you want to start looking at the ACARS data to try to figure out better search algorithms with it, then please do that, and then reach out to the Bald Geek and explain what you found. Exit, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I found the tweet I was thinking of. It turns out it's a podcast by Lloyd's Listed, and it's up in the nest.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, that flight tweet was the last sort of the good examples for this week. I will turn now to our sort of more in-depth discussion. And as I explained last week, there are some topics where the news sort of trickles in slowly, and it may not be, particularly OSINT focused, but they're interesting topics that are important, and that I like to bring up in the space so that we can get into the background of them, because they may set context for opportunities for OSINT down the road. And so the subject I wanted to bring up this week is the idea of direct espionage or transnational repression. And I'll admit that even when I was brainstorming this with those who developed topics with me, I hadn't heard the phrase transnational repression. And so, to that end, if you have a look at the first tweet in the nest, it has some links to some outside websites. And among those, there is a definition of this that is given by the FBI. And they say that essentially it's an effort by a foreign government to stalk, intimidate, or assault people, in this case in the United States, and that it can include harassment, hacking, all the way up to attempted kidnapping or, threatening the family members of an individual in their home country, or potentially the freezing of financial assets. And those are things that seem like they're happening increasingly regularly. But people, you may hear about an example here and there, but not appreciate both its scope or its frequency, and also that it seems in many ways to be increasing. And so we wanted to bring the issue forward and highlight some recent instances of these activities carried out specifically by Russia, Iran, and China. And so in that same first tweet in the nest, there is a link, for example, if you wanted to learn more about the concept in general, to a report that was put together by the organization Freedom House, and it's entitled Unsafe in America, and it has some sort of overview data in it about instances of this sort of activity in the United States. At the same time, this is a serious enough issue that there have been some recent congressional hearings on the matter. And so, again, there's a link in that tweet to the transcript of a hearing that was held in September of 2019 by a congressional committee to look at these activities in the U.S. And it's cropped up again more recently. So if you look at I think it's the second and third items in the nest, for example, the U.S. Congress has recently formed a committee called the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. And they put out a tweet noting the increasing use of these tactics by the CCP. So, while that congressional hearing was in 2019, there are committees that are very closely looking at these matters even now. And then the third item up in the nest was a recent comment that was put out by the FBI director. And this was with regard to transnational repression that had resulted in charges just recently, and that the FBI is very actively looking at these matters. So it's very much a live issue today. And so in looking at these sorts of activities with regard to China, Russia, and Iran, I thought we could start with China, because it was the breaking news related to China that caught our attention to even bring the subject up in the first place. And so I'm just adding some reference material to the nest for you. And this goes to the idea of China running foreign-based police stations. And it came to our attention because the United States pressed charges against several people in connection with, what they call these police stations, in order to try to control Chinese citizens or, people of Chinese ethnic origin who may have naturalized to the United States in the U.S. And so the first item up in the nest there is a link to the New York Times article. And this was from several years ago, but it sort of coincided with the examination of that congressional hearing in 2019, where 8 Chinese nationals were arrested for harassing Chinese dissidents in the United States. And then more recently, if you have a look at the second and third items in the nest, just on the 17th of April, the FBI arrested 2 people who they say were conspiring with the Republic of China to destroy evidence in connection with a police outpost in New York City. And so, despite the earlier charges of 8 people in 2020, not even 3 years later, they first arrested these 2 for destruction of conspiring to destroy evidence. And then if you have a look at the third item in the nest, that is a link out to a statement from the Department of Justice regarding 34 people who were charged, and they were agents of China's national police. And they were actually charged with perpetrating transnational repression, which is this, set of criminal activities that I didn't even know there was a specific label for until just a few weeks ago. Before continuing, I see Exit has her hand up. Exit, go ahead.
This is actually a question from the audience, and I admit I'm not as read up on all of these as you are, so I don't know the answer to this one either. They were asking if this is about a rapper from the Fugees.
So that's a great question. So that's an instance that you'll have to forgive me. I've only been looking at that issue casually. I think the rapper, his name was Proz, who was just convicted recently, but I thought that was in the United Kingdom. I could run a search on it, but since I'm running the conversation, maybe I will push that question out to the folks in the audience. So if you guys want to go maybe grab a source or 2 on it, and if you want to come up and explain what's happened, my understanding is that that rapper who was a member of the Fugees was accused of collaborating with the Chinese, but I think it was for something like unregistered lobbying, which I think is a little bit different than the activities under transnational repression, but I'm not 100% on that. So hopefully somebody can request the mic and come up and inform us all. So I wanted to point out that what's happening with regard to China's activities is not just restricted to the United States. And so, for example, there have been several reports in the last few months of Chinese police stations in other countries. They had been noted in the United Kingdom, and in fact, there was a notable story of a young man in the UK who went to protest them, and in order to try to harm this young man who was protesting, they went out, and members from the Chinese embassy submitted a report to the London police with a doctored email purporting to be from the young man, the protester, as a bomb threat. And but the young man, opened up all of his digital accounts and said, no, they've essentially just taken a document editor and written an email and put my name at the bottom as if it's a threat, but there's no evidence beyond that. And it was controversial because the police went so far as to charge the young man, and it started to become a bit of a cause célèbre. And some of the activists who were familiar with in the Russia-Ukraine war, like Bill Browder, who are enemies of repression wherever they may exist, came out to defend this young man. So that's an instance in the United Kingdom. But then I've added some other items up to the nest. And I guess, so before going into my examples, which are taken from Canada, I see that Jacoby has also put some resources up. So Jacoby, go ahead to explain that.
So the rapper, I think, that was being referenced by somebody in the space, he was no longer with the Fugees. His name is Praz Michael, and he was tried in federal court in Washington here in the U.S. And he was found guilty of 10 criminal counts related to what was described as an international conspiracy. And he was charged with multiple counts over a failed conspiracy to help a Malaysian businessman, Johor Lau, and the Chinese government gain access to U.S. officials, including former presidents Donald Trump and Barack Obama. He was found guilty of conspiracy to defraud the U.S., witness tampering, and acting as an unregistered agent, as Michael pointed out, of a foreign government. He is currently awaiting sentencing for up to 20 years in prison. So it's a quite different set of circumstances than it would seem. But there's a CNN article in the Nest. I'll try and find something a little bit more fulsome on it, but hopefully that's helpful.
It is, and I see that Exit's also added a CBS article, I think, to the Nest. So there are two resources there in case you'd like to dig into that question further. But yeah, again, it's that's an interesting story all on its own, but it's not an attempt to try to influence. That's an attempt to try to influence American politics, as opposed to an attempt to try to influence the behavior of either Chinese citizens or former Chinese citizens abroad. But that goes back to the sort of Chinese efforts at having police stations to enforce, if you are being a critic of the Chinese government, then they'll, take these sort of coercive efforts against you to try to silence you. And as I was suggesting, there are stories in the United Kingdom, and in addition to that, there are several instances in Canada. So if you have a look in the Nest, starting from the third item back, so sort of the third, fourth, fifth, there's a tweet up there by Radio Free Asia. And this is just one example. But there have been, I've seen many reports suggesting the same thing, that in particular, there are these organizations called the Confucius Institute, which are promoted as a sort of cultural exchange organization. And China has set up many of these in countries around the world. But the suggestion is that these organizations may be bases for, coercion. Now, whether it would be these institute outlets that have individuals acting as if they were police stations, it doesn't seem like that's the case, but that it does sort of create inroads to expatriate Chinese communities in Western countries. And so there are lots of these Confucius Institutes in the United Kingdom and in Canada and elsewhere. And I have heard several politicians calling for greater scrutiny of them, or potentially limiting their engagement, suggesting that they should be treated as, foreign agents. Continuing along in the Nest, there is a story here about police investigations in Montreal, in Canada, about efforts by Chinese representatives to harass, threaten, and intimidate individuals, and in some cases even to force targets to return to China. And this is regarded as persecution. And I thought this one was interesting because it's a claim that it's reported by the BBC, but it's a claim that's been made by a Spanish-based NGO. And so the idea that, a Spanish NGO is monitoring Chinese activities in Canada is interesting to me, and suggests, there is widespread concern about this in many countries. And I suspect that they are probably not the only private entity that is keeping their eyes on Chinese activities abroad. Looking at the fifth item back, and again, with regard to some of these, like the Confucius Institute questions, And this particular claim about an individual police officer in British Columbia, I'm presenting these, of course, as, I'm reporting the story without being able to say definitively that the organizations or entities involved are carrying out any particular criminal activity. But this tweet in the nest by Ina Mitchell is a story from British Columbia in Canada, which is, on the opposite side, just about from Montreal. And it's an instance where a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is the federal police agency that also has jurisdiction at sort of the provincial level, has been very active online promoting the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, and is out on Chinese social media apparently encouraging other Chinese nationals to join the Vancouver Police Department, which is the largest city out there, or the RCMP, which is the federal force. And also had, been making videos that were sort of contrary to Canadian government policy about Chinese citizens who had been arrested. So in particular, Meng Wanzhou, who was, I believe, the chief financial officer of Huawei, was arrested in Canada on an extradition request from the United States. And there was quite a controversy over it. And this police officer, who again is apparently Chinese national, was going out and making videos condemning the arrest and sort of, contradictory to Canadian government policy. And so that's the sort of thing where it may not be organized institutionally, like with these unofficial police stations that are reported, but where there's infiltration into existing Western institutions. Exit, go ahead.
If you don't know anything about Vancouver, you might find that story particularly important and interesting because there's so many pieces of property in Vancouver that are currently owned by Chinese nationals. And there's been lots of discussion about how many of those properties should continue to be owned by people from outside Canada in general, because there is such a housing issue in Vancouver, and because generally they're all kind of the more prominent properties that, and just in general, there's a lot of Chinese ownership and Chinese influence in Vancouver and in the politics of Vancouver. And so to see them trying to possibly influence any of the policing or the other kind of government entities in that area is kind of just part of a bigger, broader picture that's more and more concerning the more you learn about it.
Context is always important. And so while these issues have been brewing for a long time, as per the fact that the U.S. was holding congressional hearings back in 2019 on the matter, it seems like it's increasingly a point of friction, and that both sides have been working to address it. And so whether that is the new U.S. Congressional Committee, the Select Committee on the CCP, or these arrests that are being made with, now 40 or more people having been arrested in the United States in just the last week or so. But China has responded by introducing some new legislation of its own, which is revisions to its counter-espionage law. And so if you look in the nest, there are two items. The first is a link to the actual text of the revised law. And I note that it links out to a Chinese government website. And so, access that link at your own risk. But if you want to see what the text is, it's available there. And then the second item is some news coverage from Japan as it was breaking that these laws had been revised. And in coverage since then, I've seen a lot of sources concerned about the implications for Westerners in China. And just today, I was hearing about Chinese police, perhaps not raiding, might not be the right word, but visiting the offices of sort of business intelligence firms that have offices in Shanghai and other Chinese cities, and demanding that the companies release lists of their Western, experts from the West doing investigative work in China. And so while I haven't heard that that has led to arrests in the last few days, there's a lot of concern that that's sort of the precursor to more crackdowns, and that China sort of views its efforts via these alleged police stations or the Confucius Institutes as sort of equivalent to these Western business investigative outlets that are, investigating to give information to those who are investing in China. They sort of view them as equivalent. When, of course, from the Western view, the claim would be that investigation for investment purposes is not the same thing as trying to coerce people within China. But Random, I see you have something to add.
Yeah, just to speak on this real quick, but the importance of the fact that basically a lot of these police stations and these, I believe the word is transnational repression in some ways. So like the Chinese state is exerting itself out when it comes to arresting their own citizens and intimidating their own citizens in sovereign countries. That's going to involve the National Police Service, or the NPS. And that was part of the big arrests or raids that took place in New York, and the crackdowns therein. And they've come out and pretty much reported that there's probably at least another 4 major stations in the United States alone in comparison with what's going on in Canada. Just to link more of the news to these criticism stuff with Canada, as we all know, there was that whole thing with the ambassador to France questioning the sovereignty of the Balkan states, the Baltic states, which caused everybody else to have go off on the foreign ministry of China. What's lost in that is during his time as the Canadian ambassador from China, he was heavily critical about the way the Canadians were trying to crack down on Huawei and other Chinese institutions within the country and infrastructure within the country, which led to also the issues we see with Huawei, the arrest of the CEO or the VP CEO, and the other issues that come across that Exit talked about in regards to the Vancouver. I'm not going to be surprised if there's issues like that in Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, similar institutions using the Confucius Institute or other means to get inside. That being said, there are numerous groups within like friendship associations and multiple groups that the Chinese have used. I believe a friendship association was one of the backdrops for the police station in Britain. I forget which city it was located in, but off the top of my head, the other thing is in regards to the response to the West is that you're seeing the closing up of the aperture of what has been the legacy of Deng Xiaoping in China. So Deng Xiaoping succeeded Mao. He allowed the West in. He created the special economic zones. He allowed the companies to set up shop as long as they hired employers, and also gave a stake of the company to the government. The attempts to detangle the United States and China are still a bit murky and a mess. Obviously, Western companies and other companies in Asia having their employees, or Japan is a notable example of having corporate officers arrested by the CCP, has definitely caused more friction and tension. there's also the fact that there's an ongoing under the radar technology war that, while we talk about in different instances, is affecting the global markets as a whole. Just think of cobalt and the situation there. But when we're also talking about the fact that the semiconductor issue with Taiwan is always the most prevalent, we also have electric vehicle batteries in regards to EVs, China's relationship with Latin America, and the fact that there's going to be the rest of the Asian sphere is also reacting to these moves as they see the friction growing between the West and the Chinese over Taiwan. That's all I got for that one. I just want to remark, in Ukraine news, the Russians apparently struck a missile facility. So it was one of the facilities set up from the Budapest Memorandum to get rid of old Soviet ICBMs, including Satan rockets using liquid rocket fuel and other rockets with solid fuel, reportedly. And that's what caused the chain reaction explosions. That's what's being reported on right now. It's still waiting confirmation, but apparently they're trying to hit air defenses or something. But this could possibly be a very toxic fire going on in the Ukrainian town of Pativlovsk. I gotta look that name up. I might have butchered it. I apologize.
Okay, well, thanks for the sort of breaking news update. And you're absolutely right to set this conversation in the context of the economic competition, war that's going on. We try to bring these issues out one at a time in the space, and we have done conversations about Chinese economic implications. It's just hard to cover it all in any kind of, being comprehensive and in depth.
Come across or
Sorry, was there some interference there, or is my mic?
Hans was trying to say something, but I think he had mic issues.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think do you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah. Did your mic go off accidentally, or did you?
Does anyone hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, it sounds like he is having audio problems. So we'll just bring Hans down, and he can come up in a moment.
And it was Pavlorad was the name of the town. Just to correct myself, Pavlorad, Ukraine.
Okay, thanks, Brandon. So sorry for that interruption, guys. That was a speaker audio problem. Just explaining to Random's point that, of course, it's good to see everything in context. It's just a challenge to cover things in enough both sort of breadth that you can see its context, but also enough depth to understand it.
We are forever, as Exit knows, we are forever the Always Sunny in Philadelphia Charlie Day GIF. With the red string on the corkboard. Yeah, that's very true. I'll go to Jacoby in just a moment. Just before that, I made reference to the use of the sort of these repression mechanisms in the United Kingdom, and a protester who then had false allegations, allegedly. I think the charges against him have been dropped, so they were false allegations. That gentleman's name is Drew Pavlu, and I've put a tweet from Bill Browder up in the nest that was made at the time that the charges against him were dropped. So if you wanted to learn more about that, it's up there. Also, I'll just say I apologies to my co-hosts. I know I'm ridiculously flooding the nest as always. Maybe we can even start to clean up some of the early stuff from this topic, just so it doesn't get completely out of hand. Jacoby, go ahead.
I could clean it up. I just can't because I'm only a speaker. But everything that is up there is down in the replies as well. But my comment was that in relation to the transnational repression concept, that it's a relatively, I think, in my understanding, a relatively newish term, but I think there's a long history of that kind of behavior by certain regimes, governments. Russia has been known to go after dissidents in other countries for decades and decades. There's stories that I can remember from the 70s and 80s reading about that, they targeted people that they viewed as unsavory, unfriendly to their government on foreign soil, particularly in European countries, some instances of it on U.S. soil. So it is, something that has existed for a long time. It's interesting to me that this way of looking at it and terming this kind of engagement with the term transnational repression is I think just indicative of of the times and a different way of looking at state actor behavior or perceived state actor behavior on foreign soil, which I think is worth remarking on.
It seems like it's the idea of hybrid warfare brought home, in a way. And that's partly why we wanted to bring this issue forward is we hear about all these espionage cases that are breaking in Europe in particular with, Russian spies being uncovered. But just to make the point that even if you're in the UK, Canada, the United States, it's happening here too. It's just that for the most part, it's focused on nationals from those countries so as not to be because that would start to verge on very hostile acts. But obviously things like carrying out a private police station against people who are citizens of the country is clearly hostile as well. And so it's how do you deal with these new tactics? Okay, that covered off the China aspect. I'll run through Russia and Iran quickly just to highlight some of these stories. And so beginning with the second item in the nest and running forward from there, charges were just placed a little over a week ago against a woman named Berlinova, and Natalia Berlinova. And she had, this connects to the Chinese issue, because just as the Chinese appear to be acting in some ways through friendship institutes or the Confucius Institutes, Ms. Berlinova ran an organization that arranged cultural exchanges, particularly for journalists and political science students to travel to Russia. And in fact, when news of her arrest broke, I actually saw several reporters here on Twitter say, wow, I went on and, there are people who are now covering Russia very ably and who are clearly very patriotic to the United States and support Ukrainians. But they say, as I was coming up as a journalist interested in this part of the world, I went on an exchange that was organized by Berlinova's group. And so apparently, she had pretty wide-ranging impact. And the charges against her allege that she was secretly sending to the FSB photographs and passport and other info about American and Europeans who participated in the activities that she arranged, and so it's just another form of espionage sort of falling under the guise of of cultural exchange. In the same way, sort of insidious efforts in Germany were uncovered. Again, just over a week ago. It was an article by Der Spiegel, and they discovered an intelligence operation that was apparently being run out of Paris, where it was an entity that was organizing rally races through Turkey, sort of through the Central Asian republics. And the allegation is that there were significant ties between the Russian man who ran these rally races and the Russian intelligence services. Apparently going so far as this chief of a racing company receiving medals from, I believe it was the FSB. And so, this was another sort of crazy example of unexpected Russian intelligence applications. And so if you'll just bear with me a moment, I just have to pull up my examples again. It seems like the nest has been so ably cleared out that we cleared out the 2 points I was about to speak about. So
sorry about that.
That's no problem. So we see that Russia is similarly acting through this cultural exchange organization, and in the United States, and acting through these rally races in sort of Central Asia and France. Now we move to Germany, where the Germans recently announced that they were expelling 20 Russian agents or Russian diplomats who they say were engaging in, activities not consistent with diplomatic status. And Russia responded, of course, by expelling German diplomats. But if you look at the third item back, the interesting allegation, and this is from an article in the Washington Post, is that Russia was actively working with both political parties, both on the far end of the right spectrum and the far end of the left spectrum, in an effort to have them both advocate for an end to the war in Ukraine. And so it's interesting, people are pointing out that this is a very clear example of Russia explicitly trying to take advantage of horseshoe theory, which is the idea that when you get to the extreme ends of the political spectrum, they start to unite again on common ground, despite coming at it from radically different motivations. And so it seems to have been this uncovering of political interference to sort of advocate against support for Ukraine that led to the expulsion of the Russian, quotation marks, diplomats. And then if you have a look at the first item in the nest, so there are all of these fairly traditional spying activities that are going on, but under the guise of cultural exchange and similar. But then you do have some examples of much clearer sort of direct action in order to repress Russian citizens. So that first item in the nest, this goes back some months, but there's a gentleman by the name of Vladimir Osechkin who runs Gulagu.net, which is a Russian prisoners' rights organization. And Osechkin is apparently well connected, and he has been turning out a large portion of the evidence about Russia recruiting prisoners to be sent to the front lines in Ukraine. And he is outside of Russia. He had been in France, and partly because of his work, he claims that there was an assassination attempt made against him. And so it sounds a little bit like an action movie, but if you read his story, and again, this story was published by the Russian-based outlet, The Insider. He describes being at home in an apartment in, I believe it was Paris, and actually seeing like the red line of a laser sight on the wall of his apartment. And as a result of that, turning all the lights off, getting down on the floor, waiting it out for several hours, having to call on friends to flee the city. And while it sounds like a movie, the Parisian police department did open an investigation into the matter. And so I think it's plausible to include as an example of, a country reaching out against dissidents in foreign countries in a potentially violent way. Go ahead, Exit.
This is not at all OSINT, but when you describe that, all I could think of was my dad playing with a red laser with his cat and it intermittently striking the neighbor's windows, and wondering if that could possibly be an explanation for what happened there as well. But anyways, go on.
I hear you. Not making light of his situation because, Russia has clearly attempted to poison or, has killed several Russian dissidents. There's the old polonium in the tea poisoning, and there was the individual who was jabbed with an umbrella that had a sort of false compartment that apparently injected a poison into somebody, and there was the Skripal poisoning, which didn't kill its intended targets, but did kill a UK citizen. So clearly Russia is not beyond trying to kill dissidents in foreign countries. So perhaps it's happened exactly as Mr. Osechkin described. Kitty, go ahead.
Yeah, I would add that Osechkin started Gulag because from when he was able to get tapes, CC footage inside Russian prisons of prisoners being abused and put them online. And most recently, he has Wagner soldiers who are confessing to killing civilians and stuff like that he's just about to release. So actually, he released a few of them and is going to keep releasing. So he definitely is an enemy and the target of Russia.
I mean, you make a great point that he is turning out some very damning information, so I suspect he would be high on their list of people they would prefer to not be, airing Russia's dirty laundry. So we've been joined again by Hans, who is a new speaker. Hans, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to go back on the assassinations across Europe and the world from Russians. We also had I think it was a Chechen diaspora in North Sweden who had two spies or operatives coming to try to assassinate him with a hammer, but he managed to escape. So it's not it's all over the place. It's not restricted to Ukrainian friendlies, even though it's been more. But yeah, we have it all over.
Yeah, so that's a great point. I had forgotten about that Chechen story, and so that's the blogger Tumso Abdurakhmanov, if I got that right. And so I just quickly pulled up an article on that. I will add that one to the nest. So thanks for making that point. So I will add it to the nest now, and then I'll move on just to hopefully fairly quickly run through the Iranian examples in this same subject. Okay, so the Chechen examples now in the nest. Looking at the Iranian stories, so while the Chinese seem to be taking a much more systematic approach, and establishing a very long-term program with these cultural exchange organizations, and that much of the allegations are about coercive activities against their own nationals, and Russia is sort of taking the more Cold War sort of classic espionage approach. Iran appears to have been not nearly so subtle. And so just to start pointing out the items in the nest, starting with the second item back, a tweet by Jason Brodsky. And he's pointing out that the man who attacked the author Salman Rushdie, and this was, of course, more than a year ago. Mr. Rushdie suffered significant injuries. I believe he even lost an eye after having been stabbed on stage at a book reading event. The man who committed the attack, who goes by the name Hadi Matar, subsequent to that, Iran came out and rewarded him I think they gave him some land, and that's sort of endorsement after the fact. And considering that the Iranian government many years ago had put out a fatwa, or essentially price on his head, I think it's very fair to attribute the attack to being inspired by the Iranian government, and then of course rewarded by it. At the same time, looking at the third item in the nest, you can see that Iran, a little bit more closer to home, is also carrying out activity to try to coerce its citizens in Azerbaijan, where I believe there were 40 people arrested as accused Iranian agents. There's one more story. Sorry, there's a story here that I've missed, which is another Iranian activist who had somebody show up on her porch with a rifle. If you'll just bear with me, I'm just trying to find where that link is. Yes, here it is. Sorry, I missed putting it up. But that was the case where a gunman was hired by the Iranians and showed up at the home of Mahsa Ahmadinejad. So that's another blatant, essentially attempt to kill somebody on U.S. soil, which is pretty outrageous. And then finally, I'll go to hands in just one moment. So I see you guys, or we lost one of them, but I'll go to hands in a moment. And that one other instance where Iran attempted to use violence abroad recently was in in Turkey, where it was alleged that for claimed revenge purposes, that Iranian agents were going to attempt to kill Israeli citizens who were vacationing in Turkey. And so the fifth and sixth items up in the nest are news updates about the foiling of that plan, and then having the Israeli foreign minister thank Turkey for having acted swiftly to prevent the attacks. Kitty, you had your hand up a moment ago. Did you want to come in on this?
Oh, I was just going to clarify the person who you had talked about, Mahsa Ahmadinejad. Probably people would be familiar with her because she's a major activist and part of Pahlavi's team. So she's the one with like the curly hair, and she always has a flower in her hair.
Yep, and her photo is included in that post, so it's the first item in the nest. Okay. You can, because she is quite distinct. All right. Well, anyway, that sort of finishes off the survey of sort of recent bad actions, generally aimed against, a country's nationals abroad, including in the United States, Canada, France, the UK. So, when it accumulates slowly like that, you may not notice it, but when you look at it all as a piece, it's actually shocking. The audacity to attempt these things abroad. Hans, go ahead.
Like as I said, every incident is isolated, but if you patch them together, put them all together, it's still going to be quite a few foreign, Russian expats that's been eliminated during the past 10 years for different reasons, for government resistant reasons. It's stupid that we didn't see this before.
Yep. So we're on the same page. We totally agree, which is why we decided to, it's not as driven by OSINT, except for the fact that, frankly, many of the dissidents who are targeted are themselves engaged in OSINT activity, like Osechkin, and I suspect that to a degree, Ahmadinejad and others are collecting information from OSINT-like sources on the bad activities of these regimes and making them public, and that's why they're being targeted. And so again, we like to go into these background issues just to bring them forward and cover them in a little more detail. So at this point, I'm going to move on to just some updates from recent events in Ukraine. We only have maybe 20 or 30 minutes left in the conversation. But again, if anything that we talk about catches your interest, and whether it be to make a comment or ask a question, I'd encourage you to contribute. You can do that by clicking the microphone button in the bottom left of the Spaces window. Okay, so the first items I wanted to talk about were the drone attacks on the oil storage depot in Sevastopol. There was some good coverage of that here on Twitter from some OSINT accounts that will show up in the nest in just a moment. So the first of which is a thread put together by OSINT Crab, or excuse me, Intel Crab. Intel Crab. Yeah, I don't want to get that wrong. Okay, those should be populating in the nest right now. So for those who weren't following the events, the way that the attack occurred is still being worked out. It appears that a wave of several drones were sent against this oil depot that's near Sevastopol. There has been debate over how much the fuel that was burned may be used to support the naval activities nearby, or whether it included, aviation fuel or just, diesel. Apparently, it's quite a large reservoir. The open sources have been waiting for satellite imagery to come through in detail. I think it was partly delayed by cloud cover. But if you have a look at the Intel Crab's tweet, it lays out a lot of the background, including sort of what the capacity of the storage site was, angle. It has breakdown of the angle of the various videos. It has suggestions on the type of drone, which is reportedly a style called the Mugen 5, which, if not built in China, is based on designs from Chinese companies. That same drone has been used by, it's believed to have been used by Ukraine in past longer range strikes. That same night, there was also a strike on some electrical transformers in, I believe it was toward the Belgorod region. And in that instance, it was reported that 5 drones were used. And so it's likely that a significant number of drones were used here. There were reports that up to 3 waves of 10 drones may have been sent, but I've seen a fair bit of skepticism that the number would have been that large. But I thought Intel Crab did a good job of sort of laying out where the attack occurred, what the tanks were like there, and the potential impact. Exit, go ahead.
I just wanted to talk about the next tweet that I think you loaded. Yep, from Russian Bridges Go Boom. When this was all going down, there was a lot of conjecture about how much damage was going to be done, what the impact of this was going to be, and Russian Bridges went through and did a damage assessment and made a great thread that kind of details out exactly how those tanks are built and how you would target them and the ways that they were targeted, which is really helpful. It taught me a lot, so thank you for that, to read through that. And then also kind of points out that it wasn't nearly the amount of damage that people thought it was going to be when they were watching the fires, and that the fire was actually put out much faster than a lot of people were speculating that might happen. So all of those things are kind of interesting. And then I'll also note that while there was the transformer attack that same night, there was also an attack on the Perm military factory, which I will find the thread for that and put that up right away. The Russian account of it, there's a Russian article that I'll also put in the nest, and it states that it was a building for the production of plastics, but that's not actually true. There's another article that I'll put up in the nest now that you'll see that there's a whole bunch of replies where people have geolocated it to the transformer for that particular factory as well. So it looks like there is a concerted effort in one way or another by different groups. Who they are, I don't think we have enough information to point that out yet, but there's a concerted effort to attack actual electrical stations and power supply to some important targets. Not all of them are, but that production facility especially is a fairly important military target. And the fact that somebody was able to target the transformer there, as well as these targets for the oil tank farm, those are good targets, and it's nice to see them moving towards that kind of attack.
The eternal question, what air defense doing? So I think the order of hands, I think it was Rosie and then John. Go ahead, Rosie.
Hi, everybody. I know you just moved on from Iran subject, but I just wanted to add a comment. All the action you mentioned was done by IRGC, which is like a branch of military forces in Iran. They usually conduct this kind of terrorist attack outside of Iran. This is one thing that I want to mention, and there's a huge effort is going on by Iranian diaspora to list IRGC as a terrorist group. I'm not sure if you're aware or not. There's a gentleman named Wahid Beheshti who is on, I think, 64th day of hunger strike for this matter, and requesting a UK Parliament to put IRGC as a terrorist group. The second point that I wanted to mention, Riverside Kitty made a comment that Mahsa Ali-Nejad is part of the Pahlavi team, which is totally wrong. The Iranian opposition is formed from 6 different people. Pahlavi is one of them. It happened a couple of months ago with a speech in Georgetown, and if you're aware, recently the coalition sort of broke up. So Pahlavi went to its way, and then the 4 other people went the other way, and then Ismailun went the other way. So I just wanted to point that out because Iranian, let's say, diaspora or Iranian who fight against the regime right now, it is not just Pahlavi. We have people who are with different kind of wants and needs, and all the Iranian who fight for the better future for the country are not monarchists. I just wanted to point that out here. Thank you very much for the mic.
So regardless of who's doing the advocating, I'm sympathetic to the argument to designate the IRGC in order to further limit their ability to act abroad. And certainly there have been very good arguments about the degree to which family members of the Iranian regime are able to live abroad and potentially influence people abroad as well. So I hear all those concerns. Okay. We have more hands going up. So anyway, we had John, and then I guess we'll go to other. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me up. I just wanted to clarify that I think it was the Lookout. He's a pretty big Navy page. I'm pretty sure he works with Naval News and the HI Sun and others like that. But he clarified that was not that was a civilian tanker field. And then New Zealand Avscan put me on to, he sent me the coordinates for the actual one for the Black Sea Fleet, and I'll post that in the chat if you guys want.
Yeah, thanks very much. I had seen those, that analysis. I've just seen other people say they're skeptical and that, it may have been, the fuel there may have been dual purpose to the extent that it may be a civilian field normally, but that under military circumstances of military necessity that I suspect the military could have access to the fuel there as well. But assuming it is strictly civilian at the moment, I think it was the account MT Anderson, who also does lots of naval work, pointed out that it may also limit the ability to export grain and other goods that they try and push through Sevastopol. So it may interfere with sort of nefarious civilian shipping as well. Other one, go ahead.
Hi guys, good afternoon. Right now, just a little update on Ukraine. OSINT Defender and also Intelcrab have been reporting since a couple of hours ago, since the beginning of this space almost, that at least 20 Tu-95, these are the most commonly known as the bears, are airborne at this moment. And also OSINT Defender has shared that Ukrainian officials in multiple cities are telling residents to be prepared for a major Russian missile attack tonight, because possibly consistent of hundreds of missiles sometime after 02 hours. So, and they're urgent, telling all the people to be sheltered and please not ignore the sirens and alarms. These also some accounts in Russian accounts near Engels 2, one of the main bases for their bombers in the Russian Air Force. Had been hearing at least 10 bears, 10 bombers taken off from that base that contain the other 20 that have been reported flying off other bases. So at this moment, at least from the perspective of strategic bombing runs, we are mostly near to another big barrage of missiles from the Russian army. We have to see if we have any other reports from the Black Sea, because we already see in the past that when they do these massive attacks, they normally do it from all the places that they can. So that may be happening, but at least with the bombers, they're throwing all what they have at this.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I saw those reports coming out just before we began. At that point, the reports were 14 bombers in the air. Maybe a few points on that, including after the naval drone attacks on the Sevastopol inlets, I think it was almost a week ago now, the fact that there hadn't been a Russian response to that, not that obviously a response is required, but Russia often will attribute and say, this last wave was our response to whatever. And people were noting, wow, it's been 4 or 5 days and they haven't done anything as they had with past naval drone attacks. So, between that and the aerial drone attacks on Sevastopol, it takes several days to plan. So maybe they initiated the planning after the naval drone attacks, but that's interesting. Also, often we would see Caliber cruise missile carriers be sortying a day or two in advance if there's going to be a coordinated strike. So it might, I hadn't seen reports of that happening. It would be interesting to see whether this is a strike that's conducted almost entirely by bomber, and what that might imply about missile inventory levels or advanced planning. I think it was Exit and then John. Go ahead, Exit.
I just had a quick question for Russian Bridges, if he doesn't mind just giving us a quick info on the Transformers strikes that we've seen in Russia, but I think that's something that we probably want to keep an eye on, because that seems to be a tactic that people are moving towards. And so if you could give us just a really quick update on that.
Sure, thanks, Exit. I hope you guys can hear me all right. So what we know so far over the course of the war for the past 14, 15 months now, that there's been about 10, I would call them 10 significant transformer fires inside Russia. Most are close to the border, several in Belgorod, mostly in the city, some outside it a little bit, and then more over towards the to the west in Bryansk Oblast, which is where we just saw a strike, a drone video, but a strike on a transformer. And this is actually the second strike on this substation. But what's being targeted is the same assets that Russia unleashed hundreds of drone and cruise missile attacks against was these transformers. It often came down to people saying power stations or substations, but it was the transformers that were being targeted, and they took out at least 200 of these. So that's what it looks like. It's increasing activity towards on the Ukrainian part, but these are the lifeblood of industrial rail, electrified rail, manufacturing. The transport of actually energy like oil through pipelines, etc. So. That's what it looks like some targeting is going on with, and it's a little bit of a move away from the fuel depots that you burn up the product, but it can be easily replaced in no time, unlike these transformers that can have weeks or months of lead time, and there's a certain number of them, spares you could call them, so to speak, in Russia. As there's hundreds and thousands of these transformers. So it's an attritional war to upset Russian logistics and military, the war machine. But it will take time, and it's good to see more of these events taking place. So, all right, thanks.
Thanks for that. I know you follow the infrastructure developments closely, so I appreciate your attention to detail. And so, yeah, if you're listening and not familiar with Russian bridges, and you're interested in attack and defense against infrastructure elements, I'd encourage you to follow him. I think it was John and then Dean. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick to piggyback off of what you just said before, Michael, you touched on a great point. The idea that the Russians have been kind of cycling or their strikes, and we didn't see a response last week, and maybe this is kind of looking like that's what we're about to see. We've talked before in the past, I think, about, the idea put forth, I think originally by Michael Kaufman from War on the Rocks, and I believe he works for Rusi, is the idea that Russia is rolling out these strikes as they come out of the factory, so they're building them in batches and then rolling them out, and maybe these attacks came at like a downtime, so they were unable to respond. Maybe that's why we're not seeing the cruise missile carriers be sortied out.
Yeah, that's a great point. It makes me wonder. I understand that the lead time to rearm and sortie the naval carriers is on the order of several days to a week, but the rate at which they could arm bombers is much higher, and well, it will be interesting to see if the Russians make a statement after the fact, whether they attribute it specifically to the drone strike against the oil depot, or whether they also sort of toss in the naval strike from several days ago. I think it's Dean and then Piotr. Go ahead, Dean.
I'll try to do this rapid fire. First of all, I want to remind people, and this is something I used to do incident reports on at a major facility, so I'm really familiar with. Transformer failures are common, but there's a frequency that one would expect them, and when it rises beyond that frequency, that's something that should be noted. That it can reflect the amount of efficiency of the inspection on-site inspection. It can reflect the quality of the maintenance, but also look for evidence of outside strikes and things like that. But try to take it all into account. Regarding the Caucasus area, I really strongly recommend that people put their own individual countries' national interests aside and try to consider the interests of the different groups, including the governments within the countries of the Caucasus, because it'll give you some very different perspectives. It's extremely complicated. No time to go into it here, but it is extremely complicated. And it goes back over 200 years of increasing complexity. Regarding the Confucius Institute, last I checked, there was one at Stanford University. That's not uncommon for U.S. universities. And they come with rather large endowments. And it's a controversial area. And that it's even at Stanford rather raises some eyebrows. To really understand the complexities of Chinese thinking, I think Michael Pillsbury's book, The 100-Year Marathon, is useful. The article in the November-December issue of Foreign Affairs by a former university professor at one of the national universities in China that trains upcoming party elites, who's now in the United States in exile. His article was really revealing about the present regime and internal corruption. And finally, there's the Romance of the Three Kingdoms podcast by John Zhu, ZHU, in YouTube is really worth taking the 40 hours or so to listen to. It's an essential way of understanding Chinese thought and as it affects diplomacy and war and tactics and how you apply yourself. It's a thorough study of Sun Tzu and his Art of War put into a novel form. It's a Chinese classic from I think the 1400s. But it is the favorite book. It was the favorite book of Mao, and it is the favorite book of the present regime. It's an absolute classic of Chinese literature and really essential to gaining an understanding of how Chinese have traditionally viewed diplomacy and war, and thought that applies to that. It's John Zhu, and it's the Romance of the Three Kingdoms podcast. It's on YouTube. It's elsewhere. He's got his own website, but I recommend to YouTube. It's quite informative. And I think that's all. I don't want to take too much time because we're running out of time. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Dean. I think it was Piotr and then John. Go ahead, Piotr.
Can you come back to me, Michael? Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, just a thing on John Zhu. This is the same guy that I think is. He goes around to spaces. Some of us are probably coming in contact with him. So he says a lot of good things, and I do support the whole cause of any expat living in the United States. But he says some things that are really unverifiable, and also things that have been, I personally checked with us, people who work in the region, things like that don't really check out. And he kind of uses this. There's like this mantra that he goes that is literally a lie. So I'm not really sure if that's the same guy, but I would just be wary if he's a guy who has John McCain as his profile picture. So I would just be, always cross-check anything you hear. But that if that's the same guy, and I'm not trying to go against Dean or anything, but I've had multiple conversations with this guy, or sometimes seen him in spaces telling people things that he claims he's told them for the first time, but I know for a fact he hasn't because he's told me or other people things at the same time. And then he kind of ropes you in, and then he sends you a bunch of kind of material in your DMs that he also claims no one else has ever seen before. But I try to send people the same stuff, like, is this what he just sent you? And they're like, oh my goodness, he just told me that no one else has seen this. So just be careful, because I know there is sometimes a lot of confusion when it comes to that. But I mean, by all means, do your own research, everybody, and but just be wary about certain things like that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, everybody needs to do their own research, as you suggested, on who they're dealing with, particularly here on Twitter. Okay, Piotr, I guess if you're free now, go ahead.
Hi, yes, I'm back. That's basically all I wanted to say. Sorry for the background noise if you can hear it. I'm on public transport at the moment because I'm in London, not America time, and this is part of what I wanted to mention, which is basically that I've been a bit MIA because I've been trying to figure out times when I could come back to regular hosting or more consistent hosting. So wink, wink, nudge, nudge, Michael Jacoby, I might need your services again. But no, I am. You know, great space as always, Michael. I always listen to every single one you post in the you know after live or post recording stuff. Always really informative. And yeah, you know, I just wanted to do a PSA really, just to say tomorrow we've got an event on Finland, Germany, Poland. Because of the Finnish election, there's a professor of mine who has lived in Finland for like 10 years, lived in Poland for like 10. So we're going to have a deeper dive onto those 2.5 countries, if that makes sense. And then on Friday, we've got a Turkish special on the election and the implications of that on Ukraine, NATO, and the Middle East more broadly, with the director of the Turkish Institute, or Department for the Middle East Institute. So excited for that one. And the last thing I will say is that, you know, aside from these sort of guest events, I want to do more communal spaces. So what I'm probably going to start doing is to try and ensure I don't overlap with you, Aaron, and others, is host them at the time that are, you know, which are more on English time. So like 5 p.m. my time, 1 p.m. your times. I know that doesn't make much sense for some of you, but unfortunately that's really the only time that I have. So that's all I really wanted to mention. If any of you are interested in, you know, suggesting people or whatever it is, I'd love to hear from you. But thank you, and yeah, look forward to being more involved with you guys again.
Okay, well, glad to hear you're back, and the Finnish and the Turkish topics both sound interesting. So if you're listening to this and keen to hear those, check out Piotr's profile. I assume that the space invites for those are up there. Cece, you've come up. I think you had something maybe to chime into the last subject. Go ahead.
Hey, I just have a quick question. Can anybody send me the plane map where you're tracking the live tracker of the planes? That's not usually an area of interest, and right now it is very much so. If anybody can send that to me, or Michael, do you know what it is? Plane tracking, aviation tracking?
So there's one called Flight Radar 20. I believe, is it Flight Radar 24, guys? And is one, and then ADSB Exchange is the other major one.
Flight Radar tracking in the second one? Say again?
Sorry, it was Flight Radar 24, like number 2, number 4.
Oh, okay. Great. Thank you.
Yeah. And the other is called ADSB Exchange. When you're interested in flight tracking, because we had the update on the Russian bombers, is that what you're interested in?
Yeah, there's friends and family there. Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Just because, you know, like military aircraft don't have identification transmissions turned on, so you will not be able to see bombers there.
Oh, okay. So where should I go for the updated sorts?
So other than the air alert warnings that Ukraine puts out, which essentially covers like a huge territory.
I have those. I have the app on my phone.
I don't know that you can get more specific than that. You cannot see the combat aircraft tracks. Unfortunately, there are some accounts here on Twitter that follow their radio transmissions, but again, they normally don't put out enough info to like follow specifically where they are. If anybody knows more detail,
I know like Andrew Perpetua does, but he doesn't have the latest update. So yeah, I was looking for someone for like the military, the people who have the subscriptions to the ones where you can actually.
So to my understanding, even if you're subscribed, there is no ability to track combat aircraft in flight. because they're trying to stay hidden, right? But other is flight sort of fanatic, so he may have some suggestions. Go ahead.
Yeah, mostly no. The radars that are commercially available, you're not going to show the military planes. But in the case of ADSB exchange, you can see at least some of those flights. In case of when we have these alarms of bombers, Russian bombers in the air, we hear from what we call the BERNET. Is a radio frequency that we can hear via in internet app. At this moment, I forgot the name. But when we hear that BERNET is active, normally we're going to have to wait like half an hour, and we're going to know at least that a couple of these bombers are in the air. But if you want to just like look around for planes flying, you can use Flight Radar 24. That is the most used one. You can get it in the App Store, in the via also in your web browser. ADSB Exchange, you can use it on your web browser. They don't have an app at this moment. You can also use what's the name of this one again?
Do you mind following me so I can ask you a couple of questions?
Oh, actually, I made an image about the different radars, so I'm going to if
great.
Michael let me, I'm going to share it on the Nest. I made it at the beginning of the invasion, but the information is still relevant. So it's a little guide for different public apps that you can use to follow planes, to search from commercial to military to a certain degree. So that is for anyone that want to be following planes around.
I remember that thread, and that's a great one. So we'll put it up when we get it. Just because he was referred to in CC's comments, Andrew's joined us. So we'll go to Andrew first and then go around.
Oh, I don't have a response to what she said, but I do have other very related news. The Tu-95s are now they're flying towards the location where they would launch missiles, like as we speak. There are people now talking about whether they actually will launch missiles, because it seems that it might be unlikely that they launch missiles. But Ukraine just put out an air alert in response to these bombers flying into position. And in addition to the bombers, there are 2 submarines out who are armed with calibers. So that is the most up-to-date news as of like 3 minutes ago.
Okay, well, thank you for the update. Yeah, I mean, if it's just some sort of an exercise or is it a psychological operation, in any event, let's hope any damage to Ukraine is minimal. I didn't see the order, but why don't we go with Piotr and then John? Go ahead.
As usual, mine's completely unrelated, so John was probably the better bet. But no, I just wanted to also mention the Quad meeting tomorrow for the first of potentially a couple of meetings this year. And given all the related things to Taiwan and recent comments we've had around China and the Ukrainian diplomatic movements late last week, that's something else that I think is worth keeping on the back of your mind whilst you're following the immediate, developments on the ground in Ukraine, just to keep that in the back of your mind. So a major things for tomorrow.
Interesting. And that comes at the same time that I think one of the first joint exercises between India and ASEAN, naval exercises are going on. So
yeah. Well, and this also comes after the South Koreans and the US celebrated their 70th, what do you want to call it, strategical alignment celebration, and the leader sang that. Awesome. That was pretty cool, to be honest. If anyone's seen the video, it's pretty cool. But yeah, a lot going on in Asia at the moment vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Okay, thanks for that. John, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick thing. I think the thing that Other was talking about, the way to listen to the Baronet, is called, this is specifically for Cece, but I think she may have just left. I'll just DM it to her. I believe it's called WebSDR is the name of the website.
Yep. That's a great resource. I think I put that up in a space the other day. But anyway, so sorry, as we're coming sort of toward the end of the space, we're mixing topics up a little bit, but that's okay, because some of these are live updates and so on. I guess just before some concluding comments, I will say there's some material I didn't get to. Most of it was sort of the newer updates. If you have a look in the nest, in case you're interested, sort of looking, I think it's the fifth item back, just while we were talking about the airstrikes, there were some interesting developments on the idea about Ukraine having the ability to carry out airstrikes. There was a post that went up today about Ukrainians attempting to develop a pulse jet powered, very low cost missile. I have no idea about the technical feasibility of that, or whether they can come in with the economics that they're expecting, but that's one potential set of responses that could enable them to carry out more attacks like those against Sevastopol and the transformers that Russian Bridges was referring to. And then related to that, the sixth item back is a tweet by John Ridge, who noted just yesterday that the UK's Defence Department put out a request for proposal to purchase missiles with a range of between 1 and 300 kilometers, and then a warhead size of between 20 and 500 kilograms, which is obviously a huge range warhead size-wise. But the idea that the UK may be purchasing missiles for Ukraine with a range, of 100 kilometers plus, is a new and very interesting development. Before I keep going with sort of the wrap-up points, Hans has come up. So Hans, go ahead. Oh, he's just connecting. So while Hans is connecting, I'll also note the fourth item in the nest, just because we did sort of as our background deep dive on Thursday, a conversation about political prisoners.
Political prisoner. The socialistic Scandinavia is cruel. I was just going to ask you guys about the possibility for Ukraine to actually strike the Black Sea naval forces of Ukraine, besides the naval drones, and you also have the Swedish anti-naval warfare missiles, and how big of an impact would that make in the general war for them to lose Sevastopol port? So that's my main question. Thank you.
So that's a good and important question. I run these spaces for about 3 hours, and we're at 3 hours, 15 minutes now. So I'm just in the process of trying to wrap up. The broader question about the significance of the Sevastopol port is something that we can address in a future space. So I'd encourage you, to come back with that one, and we can address. It's no problem.
Late, so.
Yeah, that's no worries. I always appreciate new speakers. I was just before Hans came in, as he joined, I was making the point that we covered on a deep dive political prisoner issues on Thursday. There were some developments on that front this week. I just wanted to point out the resources, even though I won't speak to them. That's the fourth item back in the nest. And there are, some pretty interesting points there with regard to, Navalny, Vladimir Kara-Murza, and also estimates of the number of political prisoners in Belarus. Okay, before I make my final remarks, I think that Kitty, who is up as a speaker, wanted to come back on one of the points about Iran. So, Kitty, this is your chance if you'd like to chime back.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I just wanted to thank Rosie for correcting me. Apparently, when Pahlavi came back from Israel, he did unfollow Ahmadinejad, excuse me, and but there doesn't seem to be any information about what's going on with that coalition. That is pretty like under the table right now. So it may be the coalition has broken up. I just wanted to say one other thing about Pahlavi, which is that those who are supporting Pahlavi are not necessarily monarchists. In fact, most of them are probably not. They are just supporting Pahlavi as the to take the country through a referendum where they will be able to vote on the kind of country that they want. And he himself is not looking to become the king of Iran.
Okay. Well, to the extent you learned something new about sort of the relationships there, then I'm glad we had that back and forth. Okay, so Dean, I see you have your hand up, but I am looking to wrap in just a moment. So we're gonna save whatever you have for a future conversation. Exit, I'll just highlight to you that if you have a moment to re-up your puzzle to the nest and have it at the front, we'll just have a reminder that we do have a new puzzle that involves a lot of geolocation and other OSINT skills, so you might want to take a crack at that one. We're told that it's a very challenging one this week, and in addition to the challenging one, there is an easier version if you're new to these sorts of things. Just highlighting the things in the nest that you may want to pay attention to. Thanks to Other for putting up his tweet about good resources for aircraft tracking, as he said he would. So if you need to learn more about that, have a look at his thread. I'll go to Jacoby, and then I'll make my last two comments.
Oh, I just put up Exit's thing, but I see she also put it up, and she put up also the geo-confirmed tasking, so I'm sure she'll speak to those.
Will she?
I suspect she will.
Okay.
I was literally just doing what I was told and putting them up. The puzzle is there. I hope you have fun. And GeoConfirm needs help. I hope you help them.
Okay, guys. Thanks for that. Last point is our next conversation. I'm putting my reminder back to the front of the nest again. Our next conversation will be on Thursday night. We are actually planning it out a little further in advance this week because we had some conversations that people really enjoyed and they told us they wanted to talk about more. And so we will, on Thursday night, be talking about ham radio, how to get into it, and how it can be used for OSINT purposes, and some tools that you can use to do open source investigation if you are a ham radio operator. And then after that, we're going to get into a bit of a discussion about Western, particularly U.S. Naval logistics. We had some commentary about a week ago from Sal Mercogliano, who's great. I don't know that Sal can join us, but another great speaker who was there last week was John Conrad, and John will be joining us. And I know there are lots of people interested in naval affairs in the space, so it will be ham radio and naval points on Thursday. So join us if you're interested in that. The invite to that space is the first item in the nest, so you can set your reminder. And then just tonight, if you like this kind of conversation, there's a bit of a more freewheeling one that's hosted by Aaron, and that's at 10 p.m., starting at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. So the link to that also up in the nest. All right, I think that's it, guys. So thank you all very much for joining us. I think it was a great sort of wide-ranging conversation today. Thanks to all the people who came up to speak. I think they're all terrific. You should check out their profiles. They do lots of great work. And thanks to my co-hosts today, including Exit, OSINT Engineer, and Jacoby. Without the support of my co-hosts, it would be extremely hard to run these spaces. So I look forward to chatting with you guys all on Thursday. Have a great night.